Frozen grizzly bear begs men to enter her home. She's shocked by what happens next. That was the last headline anyone in the sleepy mountain village of Silverpine ever expected to read, yet the story begins on a bitterly cold February morning, in the shadow of towering pines weighed down by thick drifts of snow. The entire region was in the grip of a merciless winter. Snowbanks lined every road, icicles dangled ominously from rooftops, and the wind slashed across faces like a frozen blade. In the face of such brutal weather, wildlife often sought refuge closer to human habitation, scavenging discarded scraps or, in the strangest cases, appealing for help in ways no one would have believed. But that morning, as the sun struggled to pierce a swirling sky of gray and white, something truly astonishing took place on the remote property of a woman named Anna Caldwell. Nestled on the outskirts of Silverpine, Anna's log cabin exuded a timeless, rustic charm. The structure was hand-hewn decades ago by her grandfather, perched atop a small rise that overlooked a winding creek. A fence of pine logs demarcated the boundary, partly to keep out the deer and elk that loved raiding her meager vegetable patch in warmer seasons. In front of the cabin, a covered porch offered respite from snowstorms. Behind it, a woodpile was stacked almost to the roofline, evidence of the near-constant battle for heat that defined life here in winter. Anna had grown up in these mountains, and though she could have moved away to chase comfort in a milder climate, she stayed, drawn to the crisp air, the quiet hush of snowfall, the sense of independence that came with forging her own path off the grid. She was a woman of about 30, strong-limbed from chopping logs and clearing trails, her cheeks ruddy with perpetual windburn. On the morning our story begins, she rose before dawn. She stepped out onto the porch in heavy boots, taking a moment to inhale the biting air. It smelled of pine resin, distant smoke from a neighbor's chimney, and that intangible crispness that signaled yet another storm was approaching. The temperature had plunged overnight, likely hitting negative double digits. Anna's breath formed clouds around her face, drifting away on the breeze. As she proceeded to fetch more logs from her woodpile, a strange shape near the fence caught her eye. At first, she thought it must be a trick of the morning light, a bulky mound of snow that had gathered in an odd drift. But as she squinted, a tremor of movement broke that illusion. Whatever it was alive. She set down the armload of wood, heart pounding lightly with concern. In these mountains, it was not unheard of for a half-frozen deer or coyote to wander into a yard seeking shelter. But never had she seen something so large, so strangely motionless, merely a dozen yards from her front door. With cautious steps, she trudged across the snow-crusted ground, following the small pathway she'd shoveled the previous day. She paused at the edge of the porch, scanning for signs of danger. If it was a bear, it would be unusual for it to be out of hibernation in such extreme weather, yet not impossible. Some older or weaker bears occasionally woke up early if they couldn't store enough body fat for winter, drawn out by the desperate need to find food. Anna fumbled inside her coat pocket for the small canister of bear spray she carried whenever venturing out. She took a deep breath and advanced. The moment she drew close enough to discern features, she froze. A giant shape, thick fur clumped with ice, lay in the snow. It was a grizzly, judging by the muscular shoulders and the distinct hump below its neck. But that alone was not the shocking part. More startling was the fact that the bear appeared to be, of all things, at her gate, one massive paw limp against the frozen latch, as if it had tried to push or pull it open. The animal was motionless aside from subtle quivers of its flank, a testament to how dangerously cold it must be. Steam curled from its nostrils in faint, ragged puffs. Its eyes, half-lidded with exhaustion, flicked open at Anna's approach, revealing a dullness that spoke of profound fatigue and near hypothermia. Anna's heart clenched. A fully awake grizzly in her yard should have triggered alarm bells and immediate flight into the cabin. She knew well the dangers, a single swat from that paw could shatter bones. And yet, the bear's posture was oddly pleading. It reminded her of a dog she once saw, soaked from a freezing river, pressing itself against a door in search of warmth. She recalled her father's words from childhood: animals in distress can act unpredictably, fear, aggression, confusion. But this bear, though it possessed the raw strength to tear down her fence, simply lay there as if hoping for rescue. Its fur, coated in ice crystals, glistened in the feeble dawn light. The notion that a proud, wild creature would appear at her home, on the verge of freezing to death, was almost incomprehensible. Anna's mind raced with conflicting thoughts. The best official advice, hammered into her through countless wildlife brochures, was to keep distance, call for professional help, never feed a bear, never let it associate humans with shelter. Yet, in the pit of her stomach, she felt that ignoring the bear's silent plea would be an act of cruelty too large to bear. The phone lines in these mountains were notoriously unreliable, especially after recent storms. Even if she had perfect service, a rescue team might take hours to reach her remote property, and the bear might not last that long. She noticed the creature's fur along the ribs, alarmingly thin for a grizzly. Possibly it had failed to build sufficient reserves before winter. She swallowed. Doing nothing meant watching it die at her gate. Attempting to help it meant risking her own safety. Exhaling a shaky breath, Anna backed up slowly, eyes never leaving the bear. She had no illusions that it was docile, only that it was too weak to pose an immediate threat. Once inside her cabin, she latched the door, heart hammering in her ears. The interior was warm, a small wood stove crackling in the corner, but she could still feel a chill in her bones. She peered out the window, verifying that the grizzly hadn't moved. Then she snatched her radio from the table, hoping maybe one of her neighbors or forest rangers might pick up the signal. Static greeted her. She tried toggling channels, calling out in urgent tones. No response. Whether jammed by the storm front or obstructed by the ridges of the valley, the radio refused to transmit effectively. She stared at the wood stove, mind roiling. This was madness, trying to help a grizzly. But something about the situation tugged at her deeply, a primal empathy awakened by seeing a majestic beast brought so low by winter's cruelty. She recalled stories from her grandfather, who once described how mountain folk in old times sometimes aided bears. One tale mentioned an injured black bear that stumbled into the yard of a trapper, who ended up feeding it scraps until it recovered enough to wander off. Even so, that was a black bear, smaller and less prone to aggression than a fully grown grizzly. Then again, the one outside her fence was hardly fully grown or fully healthy. She guessed it was subadult or severely underweight. Perhaps that explained its presence and the strangeness of the event. Minutes crawled by as Anna weighed her choices. The storm outside began to intensify, flurries swirling in horizontal gusts that battered her windows. She peered again at the motionless form by the gate. If she did nothing, she was certain the bear would succumb to frostbite or starvation. But how could she possibly warm it? She didn't dare let it roam freely inside her cabin. That was beyond insane. Could she create a barrier in the mudroom, that small entry foyer, so the bear might defrost without direct contact? The mudroom was unheated, but it was at least sheltered from the wind and warmer than sub-zero temperatures. She considered barricading the door from the main cabin with furniture. It might be the only chance for the bear to survive without her risking her life entirely. Her mind made up, Anna sprang into action. She pushed her worn kitchen table against the inside door of the mudroom, stacking chairs atop it, trying to form a barricade from waist to ceiling. She found an old sheet of plywood in her storage shed that she placed across the opening for extra measure, securing it with rope. The arrangement wasn't perfect, but it might keep a weak bear from pushing into her living quarters. Next, she placed a large metal bowl near the mudroom's outer entrance, filling it with water. Then, with cautious optimism, she grabbed thick gloves, donned a heavy coat, and stepped out into the storm once more. Approaching the fence, she spoke softly. "Hey there. I don't know if you can understand me," she murmured, voice trembling slightly. I want to help." The bear lifted its head, gaze flickering with faint interest, though it made no move to rise. Anna carefully unlatched the gate, stepping around the recumbent bear, which didn't even snarl. She realized just how cold it was. Frost clung to the tips of its guard hairs, and a patch of ice had formed along one side of its muzzle. Was this truly the same fearsome species known for sheer power? "All right, come on." She gestured toward the open gate, then toward the cabin door. She felt foolish, almost as if coaxing a lost dog. The bear exhaled a raspy breath, shifting slightly. Its muscles must ache from the cold. Anna retreated a few paces, giving it room. "Please," she whispered. Whether from exhaustion or from some unspoken understanding, the grizzly slowly struggled to its feet, paws sinking in the snow. Anna's breath caught, adrenaline surging in case it lunged. But it merely staggered forward, wincing with each step. She edged backward, step by step, leading it around the side of the porch, across the yard, and up to the cabin's mudroom door. The wind whipped around them, the sky turning a pale, turbulent gray as the storm advanced. Flakes stuck to Anna's eyelashes, but she kept her gaze locked on the bear, staying a few cautious yards ahead. At last, they reached the small threshold. The door had been left slightly ajar, revealing the dim interior of the mudroom. A swirl of slightly warmer air wafted out. The bear extended its muzzle, sniffing the boundary suspiciously. Anna retreated inside, behind her makeshift barricade, hoping the animal would follow. For a tense moment, the bear lingered outside, as though fearful or uncertain. Anna's heart hammered with each tick of the clock. She realized the absurdity. She was effectively inviting a grizzly into her home, albeit only into the mudroom. One misstep, and she'd have a raging beast in her living space. But the bear gave a soft grunt, a near whimper, and lumbered in. Once inside, it collapsed onto the muddy floor, shaking violently from the cold. Anna hastily eased the door shut behind it, securing the latch. Her improvised barricade stood between them, the table stacked with chairs, the plywood barrier roped in place. Anna crouched behind it, breath quivering in puffs of steam. There, the two found themselves in close proximity, divided only by a hodgepodge fortress of wood and rope, but out of the screaming wind. It took a few moments for Anna to accept that she wasn't dreaming. A half-frozen grizzly was now in her mudroom. Outside, the wind battered the cabin, howling across the eaves. Inside, the wood stove hissed softly in the adjacent living area. The bear breathed in ragged gasps, occasionally lifting its head as if to take in the warmth. Anna spoke soothingly, "We'll get you warm, big guy." "Don't worry." She wasn't certain if the bear was male or female. She just said "guy" out of habit. Observing it more closely, she noticed the broad shape of its skull, likely a young male. Yet the details hardly mattered at this point. Over the next hour, Anna remained behind the barricade, occasionally tossing a few scraps of cooked venison near the bear's muzzle. She was well aware that feeding it might forge an unhealthy dependency, but the poor creature was obviously starving, and she had no illusions that it could survive otherwise. The bear sniffed the morsels warily before devouring them with feeble gulps. She also scooted the metal bowl of water closer, which it drank in thirsty laps. Part of her trembled at the realization that she was effectively doing everything wildlife experts warn against, feeding a grizzly, letting it associate a house with safety. But the alternative was certain death for the animal, an outcome she couldn't bear to facilitate by neglect. As the day wore on, the storm raged, piling fresh layers of snow against windows. Anna grew anxious about the possibility that the bear might recover enough strength to become a threat. She debated whether to attempt contacting wildlife services again, but the radio still delivered only static. Her cell phone was useless, as coverage here was non-existent. She considered leaving to find better reception by driving down the mountain, but the roads would be treacherous, possibly impassable in this blizzard. And if she left, who knew what state she'd find upon returning? So she waited. Occasionally, she dozed in a chair behind the barricade. The bear slept too, chest heaving, sometimes twitching in uneasy dreams. She tried not to imagine how many ways this scenario might end in disaster. Instead, she focused on the bear's plight, finding solace in each sign of improvement, the lessening of its violent shivers, its ears perking up slightly when she spoke. Evening arrived, and Anna lit a kerosene lamp in the living area, casting a soft glow over the barricade. She fed the wood stove more logs to ensure the cabin's warmth seeped partly into the mudroom. The temperature in there was still chilly, but better than outside's lethal wind chill. At one point, around midnight, she was startled awake by a scratchy thud against the barricade. Alarmed, she snatched the canister of bear spray. Her mind raced, is it trying to come through? But instead, she peered over the plywood to see the bear simply shifting positions, pressing its flank closer to the interior door. It let out a low, throaty sound, somewhere between a groan of discomfort and a wordless entreaty. She realized that, ironically, the bear wanted to be closer to the warmth. A wave of compassion coursed through her. Softening, she tossed another chunk of leftover meat in its direction. The bear gobbled it and settled again, muzzle resting on its massive forepaws. Morning arrived gradually, revealing that the storm had dumped nearly a foot of fresh snow. Rays of pale sunlight filtered through the frosted windows. Anna, stiff from sleeping upright, eased herself to her feet. She peered cautiously around the barricade, heart fluttering. The grizzly lay in a semi-curled position, covered in a light sheen of frost that must have melted and refrozen during the night. Yet its breathing was steadier, and it regarded her with eyes that seemed more alert. She couldn't be sure, but it felt as if the worst was over. Perhaps the warmth and meager food had staved off the lethal chill. Her mind wandered to practicalities. How long would the bear stay? A day? 2? Did she dare open the door to the outside and coax it to return to the wild once it regained enough strength? Also, she worried about how to handle the inevitable rummaging it might do if it grew comfortable around her place. The roads might still be impassable for at least another day, so calling official help was not an immediate option. She resolved to watch the bear's condition closely. If it tried to break in further, she'd have to repel it with the bear spray or even her grandfather's old rifle if absolutely necessary. But if it kept calm, perhaps they could coexist until nature allowed it to leave. By midday, the skies cleared, offering a crisp blue expanse above the shimmering landscape of white. Anna ventured outside to check the perimeter. Snowdrifts reached halfway up her windows, and the frigid air numbed her fingertips within minutes. Returning inside, she was greeted by the sight of the grizzly standing shakily on all fours, sniffing the barricade. She froze, ready to bolt behind the furniture if it lunged. Instead, it made a low, moaning sound and turned its massive head toward the door from which it had entered. Recognition sparked in Anna's eyes. Maybe the bear now desired to leave. She steeled herself, carefully untying the ropes that held the plywood. Her adrenaline spiked again. One wrong move, and all her caution would be in vain. In slow, deliberate motions, she created a gap large enough for the bear to pass. It did not charge her. Instead, it let out a gusty breath, then plodded to the door, pawing at the wood. Anna unlatched it from her side and pulled it open a crack. The wind outside buffeted them both. The bear sniffed, ears twitching at the scent of the open wilderness. A part of Anna's heart constricted. Would it truly be okay out there, or was it still too weak to survive? She stood back to allow it room, pulse pounding in her ears. After an agonizing moment, the grizzly took a few halting steps into the blinding snow. At the threshold, it paused, turning its head slightly to glance back at Anna. Their gazes locked. Anna felt a wave of emotion, a sense that this creature she'd sheltered was, in its own way, acknowledging her kindness. Then it stepped forward and disappeared into a swirl of white. Anna quickly secured the door, leaning against it, breath ragged with relief, anxiety, and an inexplicable pang of loss. The mudroom felt strangely empty now, just a puddle of melted snow and scattered bits of fur on the floor to prove the surreal event had taken place. Exhausted, she sank to the floor, letting the tension drain from her limbs. Outside, the wind continued to whistle, but a faint sense of triumph warmed Anna's chest. Somehow, someway, she had saved a life. High above the horizon, the late winter sun sparkled on drifts of fresh powder, turning every slope and boulder into a dazzling sculpture of white. Inside her snug cabin, Anna Caldwell sat at the mudroom's threshold, gazing at the spot where the half-frozen Grizzly had stood only hours earlier. The place still bore the messy evidence of its brief stay: melted snow puddles, a smattering of fur, and a few deep paw prints stamped in the slush. The bear had wandered out in a fragile state, leaving only a swirl of snow in its wake. Relief and concern tangled in Anna's mind. She'd done all she could to keep it alive during the brutal night, yet she couldn't shake the nagging worry: is it strong enough to survive out there? Once she'd mustered the energy to stand, Anna carefully dismantled her makeshift barricade, easing the wooden chairs and table back into their usual spots in the main living area. Even though the danger was presumably past, her hands trembled with residual adrenaline. Her exhausted limbs ached from a night of restless vigil. Every so often, she paused to listen for signs that the bear might return, a low grunt at the door or a scrape of massive claws. Yet all she heard was the howling wind and the soft crackle of her wood stove. Before long, she leaned over the stove, stoking the embers with fresh logs to chase away the morning chill that still clung to the cabin's corners. The dancing flames cast wavering shadows across the walls, lending a familiar comfort. Anna let out a long breath, her chest tight with pent-up tension. Even now, she found it surreal that she'd shared her home, albeit briefly, with a fully grown Grizzly. Most people would label the act foolhardy or downright insane. But desperation, empathy, and lack of outside help had forged an unlikely scenario. In the quiet aftermath, Anna reflected that while she might have risked her own life, she couldn't have stood idly by as a living creature froze to death on her doorstep. She set a kettle on the stove to heat water for tea. While the water slowly came to a simmer, she rummaged through her pantry for something to eat, realizing she'd barely touched any proper meal since the previous morning. A wave of hunger hit her, though her nerves still buzzed. Eventually, she prepared a simple breakfast: warm biscuits and some canned peaches she'd saved for a treat. She ate mechanically, mind drifting back to the moment she'd coaxed the bear indoors, how it had collapsed like a rag doll on the mudroom floor. The sun climbed higher, spilling cold light across her yard through the windows. With the storm's fury subsided, a pristine hush enveloped the forest. Anna decided it was time to investigate any sign of the bear's tracks or retreat. Perhaps the creature had stayed close, seeking cover in a nearby thicket. She also needed to check if the fresh snow had blocked her drive entirely. Taking a deep breath, she bundled up in her thick parka, tugging on gloves and boots that were still damp from the day before. She also took her rifle from the locked cabinet, an old .30-06 passed down from her father. She didn't relish the thought of using it, but safety in these woods was paramount. Stepping outside, she waded through drifts up to her knees. The air was crisp as glass, each breath a cloud that lingered in the stillness. Overhead, the sky was a startling shade of blue, as though nature apologized for the previous day's tempest. Anna trudged around the perimeter of her yard, scanning for disturbed snow. Sure enough, large paw prints trailed away from the cabin's mudroom door, curving around the fence, and disappearing into a dense copse of pines near the creek. She followed them cautiously. The tracks were staggered, each print far apart, indicating the bear had at least managed a walking gait. However, the deep impressions and occasional drag marks suggested its steps were unsteady. A pang shot through her heart. Did it keel over somewhere out of sight? She inched closer to the pines, a rifle resting in the crook of her elbow, eyes vigilant for movement or the rustle of branches. As she came upon a patch of flattened snow beneath the trees, she saw where the bear had paused or collapsed briefly. The prints then veered toward the creek, but the terrain there was steeply banked with ice. Her mind painted a grim picture. If the bear had tried to cross and the ice gave way. She shuddered. Yet the tracks continued upstream, near the water's edge, before disappearing beneath layers of drift. It was impossible to track further without risking her own safety near the half-frozen creek. She halted, listening for any sign, splashes, growls, or a heavy body tramping through the underbrush. Nothing. Eventually, Anna returned to her cabin with mixed feelings. The bear was gone, for better or worse. She could only hope it found a sheltered hollow or some hidden den. Perhaps it might slip into a late, partial hibernation if it discovered a suitable hideaway. The question lingered, should she call the authorities or park rangers once roads cleared? Official wildlife rehab might be the creature's best hope, yet typically, authorities euthanized bears that had become too accustomed to human contact. Anna cringed at the thought. This one might not have intentionally sought a handout, it was just desperate to survive a lethal freeze. She resolved to keep quiet unless absolutely necessary, not wanting to condemn the animal to an uncertain fate at the hands of bureaucracy. Later that day, she attempted once more to use her radio to contact neighbors, but only static responded. She guessed that many were hunkered down, waiting for the road crews to plow. She knew the local ranger station was at least 10 miles away, across ridges likely still deep in snowdrifts. If they were out on patrol, they might not return to the station for hours. Shrugging off frustration, Anna spent the afternoon tidying the mudroom, sweeping out the soaked straw mats, scrubbing away any residue where the bear had lain. As she worked, she recalled details of the bear's expression, the trembling muzzle, the faint gratitude in its eyes. 1,000 questions peppered her mind. Could a bear truly feel gratitude? Or was it purely exhausted and resigned to any kindness offered? Dusk arrived swiftly in winter's short daylight hours. The wind picked up again, rattling the eaves with an ominous whistle. Anna busied herself cooking a hearty stew of potatoes, onions, and diced venison, hoping a warm meal might soothe her nerves. Yet each time the cabin settled with a creak or a draft, her heart leapt to her throat, half expecting to hear a scratch at the door. She told herself not to be paranoid. The bear was gone, presumably back to the wilderness. But a stray thought nagged, what if it returns? Although she had the barricade plan, it felt unsustainable long-term. She couldn't keep playing hostess to a wild grizzly each cold night. Such an arrangement threatened them both. Night fell, the forest swallowed by darkness. Snow-laden clouds obscured the moon, leaving the cabin's windows reflecting only pitch-black emptiness. After cleaning up the kitchen, Anna settled by the fire with a battered journal in which she sometimes jotted down her daily impressions. Flipping to a blank page, she tried to articulate the surreal events. A grizzly came to my gate at dawn, half frozen. I let it into the mudroom. Stayed the night. Left in the morning. I'm still shaking from it. She paused, considering how meager words felt compared to the reality of having gazed into that bear's desperate eyes. She wrote a bit about the heartbreak of seeing such a powerful creature brought so low, how the storm had sealed her fate that morning, no outside help, no alternative. She also described her guilt at providing food, knowing the implications. Deep in her gut, though, she felt it was the right choice. If a living being knocks on your door in mortal peril, can you truly turn it away, even if it's a wild grizzly? Eventually, weariness overcame her. She banked the fire, tested the locks on both doors, and retreated to her small bedroom. A reading lamp on the bedside table illuminated a few old novels, but she was too drained for reading. Crawling under thick blankets, she let the howling wind lull her into a fitful sleep. Dreamlike images danced in her mind, the bear's massive paw pushing on her gate, ice crystals clinging to its fur, the quiet hush as it lay inside her home. Her dreams, though, took a darker turn. She pictured the bear stumbling alone through endless snowfields, collapsing at last under a gnarled pine, its breath fading into the hush of falling snow. Morning dawned bright but frigid. After a quick breakfast, Anna donned her coat again, determined to check the driveway. Maybe she could attempt to drive into town now that the storm had ceased. Stepping outside, she discovered the driveway was indeed buried under high drifts. An hour of labor with her snow shovel hardly made a dent. Panting, she realized she might need a snowplow or at least a neighbor's tractor to clear a path. No help seemed imminent. She trudged back into the cabin, cheeks stinging from the cold. She tried the radio again, scanning channels, and at last, a faint crackle broke the monotony of static. Anyone? The voice was garbled, almost inaudible. Anna pressed the transmit button. Hello, this is Anna Caldwell on the North Ridge. Do you read me? More static, then a faint, yes, Anna, copy. Relief sparked. She recognized the voice. It sounded like Tom Baxter, a local retiree who sometimes monitored emergency channels from his own property. Tom, can you hear me? She asked. Barely, came the reply. You stuck out there. Anna explained that her driveway was blocked, but she was otherwise safe. Is there any plow scheduled? Over, she asked, hoping to glean a timeline. She considered whether to mention the bear but hesitated. If Tom related to the Rangers, they might come with tranquilizers or worse. And unless the bear reappeared, it might be for nothing. Tom's voice crackled in and out, they're clearing main roads first. Might be a day or two before they reach the side roads. Weather looks iffy. Another front on the horizon. Need anything, Anna? She felt a pang of indecision but answered, I'm okay for supplies. Just stranded a bit. Thanks, Tom. The radio fizzled, the tenuous connection lost. Sighing, Anna set down the device. A day or two more of isolation was manageable, but her nerves prickled at the thought of that second storm front. If the temperatures plummeted further, would the Grizzly re-emerge, seeking warmth again? She scolded herself for letting her mind run wild. The bear is gone. It has the entire forest to roam. Why would it return? Yet a tiny voice in her mind answered, because it found shelter here once. In the afternoon, Anna busied herself mending a torn set of curtains and double-checking her stash of firewood. She had enough for a couple of weeks, but decided to chop more logs for peace of mind. Bundling up, she trudged to the woodpile, setting up her axe. The rhythmic chop of blade through pine logs provided a meditative outlet. Each downward swing released some measure of tension. The sun arced overhead, casting long shadows across the yard. She paused occasionally to sip water, scanning the perimeter out of habit. No sign of movement. Around mid-afternoon, as she stacked split logs by the cabin wall, her peripheral vision caught something, far off at the edge of the tree line. She froze, heart leaping. But a moment later, she realized it was just a deer bounding away, startled by her presence. Letting out a shaky exhale, she resumed her chore. By dusk, she'd significantly bolstered her pile of wood. Returning indoors, she shucked off her coat, wishing she could simply hop in a truck and drive to a friend's place for the evening to quell the lingering sense of unease. But that wasn't an option yet. Nightfall came more gently this time, with a sky dotted by brilliant stars. No new storm battered her windows. She settled in with a small lamp, reading old letters from her grandfather that spoke of living harmoniously in the wild. One passage struck her. "Sometimes, Anna, the forest tests your kindness with a great risk. It's not about being fearless, it's about caring enough to take a chance. You'll know when that time comes." The words felt uncannily prophetic now. She closed the letter, pressing it to her heart. A soft knock on the door jolted her upright, except it wasn't a knock, more like a subtle scraping. The hair on her arms prickled. She set the letter aside, heart thundering. Carefully approaching the mudroom door, she listened. Another faint scratch, then a low moan. Impossible, she thought. Surely not. Yet the sound repeated. Stomach twisting, she peered out a small window above the doorknob. There, in the weak glow of a single porch lantern, stood the Grizzly. Its muzzle brushed the door, a pleading posture disturbingly similar to how she'd first found it. Anna's pulse hammered. The bear was back, presumably no better off. Her mind raced. She flicked on the outdoor light, revealing the animal's form. Snow clung to its fur again, though not as thickly. It looked ragged, weary. Yet in its eyes shone a distinct recognition, as if it remembered her and the warmth within. She let out a shaky breath. What now? Letting it in again would only reinforce the pattern, eroding its natural fear of humans. But to deny it in sub-zero temperatures, after it had already experienced shelter, felt unbearably cruel. She cursed under her breath at the moral quandary. Slowly, she unlatched the door, rifle resting on a nearby table just in case. The bear didn't lunge but stood there, sides heaving. Its breath fogged the cold air. Repeating her approach from 2 nights prior, Anna backed toward the makeshift barricade materials, eyes locked on the bear. It plodded inside the mudroom, shivering less severely this time, as though it recalled the routine. She erected the chairs and table quickly, creating the half-wall barrier. The bear collapsed onto the floor again, exhaling in a heavy sigh. A swirl of conflicting emotions ripped through her. Compassion, guilt, fear, and a flicker of awe at the trust forming between them. Softly, she murmured, "So, you came back. I guess you couldn't find another spot, huh?" The bear, of course, gave no response beyond an exhausted grunt, but its ears twitched at her voice. She provided a small bowl of water once again, plus a few scraps of venison she had left from her freezer stores. The bear devoured them greedily, then settled, panting quietly. Anna crouched behind her barricade, brow knitted in thought. This wasn't sustainable. But for tonight, at least, she'd keep it from freezing. In a day or two, if the roads opened, she could phone someone for help, though she feared the probable outcome. She stayed up most of that night, occasionally dozing with her head on crossed arms. The bear dozed too, stirring once in a while, as though testing the barricade. But it made no violent moves, seemingly content just to be out of the bitter cold. Around dawn, it stood again, nudging the door expectantly. Heart pounding, Anna cleared the barricade, letting it out. The creature ambled away, disappearing into the pines much like before. That second departure felt even more surreal. She watched it vanish, hands clenched in tension. The pattern was set. A wild grizzly had turned her mudroom into a refuge from nature's wrath. The day that followed proved warmer. Temperatures rose enough to start melting small patches of snow on the roads, and Anna heard the distant rumble of a plow truck around midday. Sure enough, by late afternoon, she found her driveway partially cleared. Hope flared that she might drive into Silverpine the next morning. With this prospect, she realized she needed a plan. If the bear returned once more that night, she'd have a choice: either keep silent and perpetuate this clandestine arrangement or inform a ranger, risking the bear's capture or euthanasia. The moral burden weighed on her like a lead blanket. As dusk neared, she carefully checked her supplies. She had enough venison scraps to feed it one more time if it appeared. Part of her prayed it wouldn't. Maybe it found a den, or the slight thaw helped it forage. She paced the living room, gaze flicking to the mudroom door every few minutes. When night fell fully, her nerves spiked at every creak. Yet the hours passed with no scratching, no telltale moan. Anna felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. Midnight arrived quietly, the wind whispering through tall pines. She banked the fire and crept to bed, hugging the old quilt around her shoulders. Maybe it's over, she thought. Just past 2 a.m., a soft thump shook her awake. She bolted upright, heart pounding. For a moment, she prayed it was just a shifting log in the wood stove or the house settling. Then came another faint bump, this time clearly from the mudroom. Shaking off sleep, she grabbed the rifle, adrenaline coursing through her veins. In her nightclothes, she padded silently to the main door, pressing her ear to it. A muffled moan, unmistakably the bear again. She sucked in a breath, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. It was like seeing a lost dog begging for entrance, except this dog weighed hundreds of pounds and was one of North America's most formidable predators. Resignation setting in, she unlatched the door. The grizzly stepped in, breathing hard, patches of ice clinging to its chest. She secured the barricade in near darkness, a lone oil lamp on the table casting long shadows. The bear all but collapsed once more, exhaling in raspy huffs. Kneeling behind the barricade, Anna felt her chest tighten with compassion. He's not going to survive this winter on his own, she realized, her eyes clouding with tears. His attempts to scavenge or find shelter must have failed. Her cabin had become his last resort. She spent the wee hours of morning feeding him scraps, talking to him in soothing whispers despite knowing he couldn't understand her words. When dawn finally broke, he stood, apparently ready to leave yet again. Anna's hand shook as she lifted the barricade aside, letting him out into the pale morning light. He trudged off, limping slightly on one hind leg. The sight was almost too much to bear, pun intended. She suspected each day wore him down further, making these returns for warmth a fleeting lifeline. That morning, Anna resolved it couldn't continue. The bear needed professional help or relocation. As soon as the plow truck finished clearing the rest of her drive, she'd load up her gear and head to the ranger station. They had the tranquilizers and expertise to assess whether rehab was possible. A pang in her gut warned that the rangers might see him as a danger, but letting him slowly starve or freeze to death was equally cruel. Bracing herself, she prepared for a trip into town, steeling her emotions. Sure enough, around noon, the grumble of a county plow truck echoed through the trees. A young operator named Kyle hopped out to greet Anna, joking about how the storms never gave them a break. While he cleared the final barrier of snow, Anna packed her truck with essentials, plus a bit of extra food for herself in case the road conditions were worse than expected. She also tucked her grandfather's rifle behind the seat, uncertain of what she might face. By early afternoon, the drive was sufficiently cleared for her to attempt the winding road down the mountain. She thanked Kyle, who wished her luck. Feeling a pang of dread, she secured her cabin, made sure the stove was safely damped down, and climbed into her old 4x4. It rumbled to life, engine protesting the cold. She looked back at the log cabin, half expecting the bear to appear from the tree line, but the forest stood silent. Time to go, she thought. Navigating the serpentine road demanded full concentration. Ice glazed the corners, and one wrong turn could send her sliding into a ravine. She inched along, tires gripping precariously. Snow-laden branches occasionally whipped the sides of the truck. The journey that usually took half an hour stretched to well over an hour in these conditions. Finally, the trees parted, revealing the outskirts of Silverpine, a scattering of rustic homes, a gas station, a diner, and a ranger outpost near the main highway. She parked outside the ranger station, a small wooden structure with an antenna tower behind it. Her breath plumed in the cold as she hurried inside. A wave of warmth hit her, along with the sight of Ranger Louise Henderson, a stalwart woman with keen eyes who'd known Anna's family for years. Louise greeted her with curiosity. "Anna, you braved the roads. Everything all right?" Anna's insides twisted. She weighed how much to reveal. "I encountered a grizzly near my place," she began carefully. She left out the part about letting it inside. "It's in bad shape, looks starved or injured. I'm worried it won't make it through the winter." Louise's expression hardened with concern. "That's unusual for a grizzly this time of year, most are denayed up. If it's wandering around, especially near people, that's trouble." She grabbed a clipboard, jotting notes. "Did it act aggressive?" Anna swallowed. "No, more like, desperate. Really weak." She cringed internally, aware she was tiptoeing around the truth. Louise nodded anyway, familiar with how unpredictable bears could become when starving. "We might need to track it," Louise said, reaching for a map pinned to the wall. "Where exactly was this?" Anna stepped forward, pointing to a rough area near her cabin's location. "Here. I saw tracks leading toward the creek." The bear came close. She hesitated, unsure how much detail to add. Louise pursed her lips. "We can send a patrol up. We have a few tranquilizers for if it's dangerously malnourished or too habituated. We'll see if a rehab facility can take it, assuming it's not too far gone. Or we might relocate it deeper in the preserve." She glanced at Anna with a measured stare. "Any idea if it's been accessing human food sources or rummaging near houses?" Anna's heart pounded. She could lie, or at least obscure the truth. "I'm not sure," she hedged. "It just seemed drawn to my property. Possibly smelled something, but I don't store trash outside." That was technically true, she'd not left garbage lying around. Yet she had fed the bear scraps indoors. Guilt gnawed at her. Louise studied her a moment, but decided not to press. "All right, let me radio the team. We'll head out tomorrow if the weather holds. You can ride with us if you want to show the location. Or, if you prefer, we'll collect the details and let you know." Anna nodded, simultaneously relieved and worried. She gave them precise directions to her place, though she omitted mention of the mudroom events. Louise tapped it into her computer system. "With any luck, we'll find it quickly and do what we can," she said. An uncomfortable heaviness settled in Anna's chest. She thanked Louise, then stepped back outside, the winter air biting her cheeks. In her truck, she sat gripping the wheel, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She'd done the right thing, right? Bringing official help might give the bear a shot at rehab if it truly was starving or injured. But if the rangers deemed it a threat, they might euthanize it. She pictured the bear's weary eyes, how it had pressed against her door. Please, let them help it, not kill it. Striving to push down her dread, she drove into the center of Silverpine, a single main street flanked by a small grocery, a hardware store, and a diner. She parked near the diner to grab a warm meal and gather her composure. Inside, the familiar smell of frying bacon and strong coffee offered a nostalgic comfort. A few locals recognized her, greeting her with nods. News traveled fast in a tiny town, so she wasn't surprised when old Bill Torson, a retired logger, approached her booth. "Heard you had a bear sighting near your place," he said, voice gruff. "Louise mentioned it on the radio, said you'd come in." Anna forced a small smile, stirring sugar into her coffee. "Yep. Seems it's struggling. The rangers will check it tomorrow." Bill shook his head. "Poor beast. Winters can be cruel up here. Some folks say we should let nature take its course, but I respect that you're trying to help." His weathered face crinkled in empathy, and Anna felt her shoulders ease slightly. She'd worried about condemnation for interfering with a wild animal. Bill offered her a piece of advice: the worst that can happen is they find it's beyond saving. But at least you tried. After finishing her meal, Anna stocked up on essentials at the grocery: flour, canned goods, salt, a bit of fresh produce, and then headed back up the mountain, determined to be prepared for the Rangers' arrival next day. The sun dipped low, painting the snowy ridges in hues of gold and pink. Despite the beauty, her gut churned with uncertainty. She kept glancing at the back of her truck, where her supplies and rifle lay, wishing there was a surefire path to spare the bear from further suffering. By the time she reached her cabin, the last rays of twilight had vanished. She parked, hauled groceries inside, and stoked the fire. Glancing at the mudroom door, she half expected to see the bear waiting yet again. The yard was empty, footprints from prior visits partially filled with drifted snow. She readied the barricade materials anyway, in case it returned overnight. Sleep came slowly, her mind swirling with visions of tranquilizer darts, the possibility of relocation, and the guilt-laden memory of letting a wild predator find sanctuary in her home. Dawn broke bright, and Anna dressed quickly, anticipating the Rangers. She made a pot of coffee, pacing the living room. Sure enough, around mid-morning, she heard an engine's rumble and spied a forest green 4x4 winding up her driveway. Inside it sat Ranger Louise Henderson and a junior ranger, Brian, each bundled in heavy winter gear. A second vehicle followed, hauling a wildlife trailer outfitted with specialized compartments for animal transport. Anxiety knotted in Anna's belly as she went out to greet them. Louise hopped out, scanning the surroundings with a professional air. "Show us where you last saw its tracks," she said. Brian began unloading equipment: tranquilizer rifles, a med kit, and what looked like nets. Anna couldn't help but notice how official it all seemed. Her chest tightened, but she guided them to the pine stand where she'd trailed the bear's footprints. The Rangers examined the location, muttering about how the bear's trail meandered toward the creek. Louise turned to Anna. "We'll do a quick sweep along the creek line. If it's nearby, we might find it bedded down. If it's truly in dire shape, it may not be far." Anna bit her lip, heart thumping. "I can come along if you like. I know these woods well." Louise nodded. Yes, that'd help. And so they set off, snow crunching underfoot. Brian carried a tranquilizer rifle, scanning the underbrush. The group moved slowly, calling out occasionally, "Bear. Hiya, bear," to avoid spooking it. Time crawled, the cold biting at their fingers. Anna's mind raced with fear that they'd find the bear collapsed, lifeless. In a twisted way, maybe that would save it from being shot if the Rangers deemed it aggressive. Another pang of guilt welled up. She didn't want it dead, she wanted it to have a future. By late afternoon, they'd combed the area thoroughly, finding only old tracks. No fresh signs, no scat, no bedding. Louise frowned. "He's not around here, or he moved on," she said, quietly deflated. "We'll keep an eye out. If he shows up at another residence, we'll hear about it." She cast Anna a probing look. "You're certain he was close by, right?" Anna nodded, swallowing. "Absolutely. But maybe the slight thaw let him travel farther. Or he found a new spot." Inside, she felt a swirl of relief. No confrontation, no forced relocation. Yet a thread of sadness persisted, thinking that maybe the bear roamed farther into the wild, still suffering. Louise shrugged. "We'll file a report. If he resurfaces, let us know. Meanwhile, don't feed or encourage him if he comes back. We'd prefer to handle it." Anna merely said, "Of course," though a flush of guilt heated her cheeks. She walked them back to the Ranger vehicles. Louise thanked her for the tips, instructing her to radio if anything changed. Soon, the convoy rumbled down the driveway, leaving Anna alone once more. She stood there, watching the trucks vanish, clouds of exhaust fading in the crisp air. Snow drifted lazily from the treetops, and the hush enveloped the forest again. She felt spent, both physically and emotionally. That night, no bear arrived. Nor the next night. The days stretched into a full week, during which a minor storm blew through, depositing another few inches of powder. With each passing day, Anna's memory of the half-frozen Grizzly lingered, an echo in the mudroom. Sometimes she caught herself glancing out the window at dusk, expecting to see that forlorn shape by the fence. But it never appeared. She resumed her quiet routines, chopping wood, cooking solitary meals, reading by lamplight. She'd often find herself flipping to the pages in her journal describing the rescue, wondering if it had all been a strange dream. 2 weeks later, a mild spell of weather arrived, bringing a partial thaw. Patches of ground emerged in sunny clearings. One bright morning, Anna decided to hike along a ridge where she could see miles of forest below. Grabbing her backpack and rifle, for safety, she set out, heart heavy with curiosity about the bear's fate. She climbed a winding trail, pausing often to catch her breath. The air smelled of damp pine needles, a pleasant change from the relentless frost. At last, she reached an overlook, a rocky outcrop that offered a panoramic view of Silver Pine Valley. There, perched on a boulder, she surveyed the expanse. A sense of peace overcame her, though her thoughts kept drifting to that starved grizzly. Had it succumbed to the elements? Or found a hidden den? Ranger patrols reported no sightings, no new incidents. She exhaled, letting the forest's grandeur fill her senses. Snow-laden peaks gleamed on the horizon, and distant treetops swayed like a great green sea. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she spotted motion far below, a dark shape, slowly climbing a slope near a stream. She lifted her binoculars, pulse racing. A solitary bear moved across the slope, pausing frequently to sniff at the thawing ground. Anna's heart pounded. Even from this distance, she could see it was thin, ribs slightly visible beneath patchy fur. Yet it trudged onward, seemingly not on the brink of collapse. She watched, enraptured, as it wove through stands of trees. Every few steps, it paused, possibly scavenging for roots or insects beneath the snow. Then, to her amazement, it turned sideways, giving a clearer silhouette. An old patch of missing fur on its right shoulder, exactly where she recalled large ice clumps. This had to be her grizzly. Tears pricked her eyes. The bear was alive, forging onward in the wilderness. She felt a flood of relief and gratitude, as if a heavy weight lifted from her chest. She followed it with the binoculars for several minutes, marveling at its resilience. Though it still looked underweight, it moved with more steadiness than before. Anna wondered if that brief refuge in her mudroom had provided just enough strength to push through the hardest weeks of winter. After a time, the bear vanished into the distant pines, swallowed by the vast landscape. Anna lowered the binoculars, tears rolling down her cheeks. She murmured softly, "Go on. Live." The wind carried her voice away, lost in the endless panorama. In that quiet moment, a profound sense of kinship with nature swept through her. The risk she took had not been in vain. She'd given a battered creature a second chance. No one else might ever know the depths of what transpired in her cabin, but the memory of that unspoken trust would remain with her forever. Eventually, she packed up and descended the ridge, her heart aglow with hope. Back at the cabin, she lit a small fire, reflecting that though the bear would never be her friend in any conventional sense, they shared an unbreakable bond forged by compassion in a time of dire need. Perhaps the bear would wander miles away, never glimpsing her cabin again. But if by some chance it returned, she couldn't say for sure she'd turn it away. Love for the wild sometimes demanded bending the rules, trusting instincts over official advisories. In the evenings that followed, she found herself smiling more freely. She kept one ear attuned for possible scratching at the door but accepted that the best outcome was for the bear to stay in the forest. Spring would come soon, bringing fresh greenery and salmon runs in the streams, easing the grizzly's hunger. With each budding day, she prayed the animal would fatten on nature's bounty, free from the lure of human dwellings. A few more weeks slipped by, each day carrying subtle signs that the harsh winter would soon yield to spring's first whispers. The sky lingered a bit lighter in the evenings, the snow atop roofs began to melt in steady drips, and a steady trickle of water under the ice hinted that creeks might soon roar back to life. Anna Caldwell, still living alone in her rustic log cabin, felt an undercurrent of optimism mingling with a gentle melancholy. Since spotting the grizzly from that distant overlook, she'd returned there once or twice more, each time scanning the slopes below. Sometimes she caught a fleeting glimpse of what could be a large bear roaming the edges of a tree stand, and each sighting buoyed her spirits. Other times, all she saw were deer or an occasional elk herd trudging across the thinning snowfields. Throughout this transitional period, Anna continued her daily routines. She chopped more firewood, in case of a sudden freeze, stocked her cupboard with enough dried goods and canned staples to last another month, and maintained her seldom-used truck, which, thanks to improved road conditions, could now carry her into the nearby town of Silverpine without too much trouble. Her relationship with the townspeople and rangers felt delicately balanced between normalcy and secret knowledge. She hadn't revealed the full truth about how the grizzly had repeatedly used her mudroom as a refuge. At times, this half-truth weighed on her, but she convinced herself it was best for the bear's sake. Letting it remain an enigma gave it the freedom to wander without the rangers setting traps or deciding on a lethal course of action. One windy afternoon, while Anna sat at her kitchen table, writing a letter to an old friend out east, she heard the distant rumble of a car engine approaching. Setting down her pen, she peered through the window to see a battered old pickup climbing her driveway in a swirl of dust and melting snow. After a moment, she recognized Bill Torson, the retired logger she'd spoken to in the diner. Though they were on friendly terms, he rarely visited unannounced. Anna quickly opened the door to greet him, stepping onto her porch as Bill parked near the woodpile and climbed out. His thick jacket and worn boots betrayed a life lived in these rugged mountains. "Afternoon, Anna," he called, raising a gloved hand in greeting. "Hope I'm not intruding. I tried raising you on the radio, but must have missed you." Anna shook her head with a friendly smile. "No worries, Bill. Radio reception's still spotty." She gestured toward the cabin door. "Come on in, I've got coffee on the stove." Bill nodded gratefully, following her inside, where the warmth of the wood stove and the cozy scent of brewing coffee contrasted with the gusty chill outside. He settled at her kitchen table, removing his cap and smoothing his silvery hair. Anna offered him a mug, which he cradled between calloused hands. The two sat quietly for a moment, steam rising gently between them, until Bill cleared his throat. "I wanted to talk about, well, the bear," he admitted, eyes flicking to Anna's in a knowing way. "Folks in town say you had quite the encounter, but no one knows details. There's rumors, somebody claims they overheard you telling the ranger about tracks near your property. Another claims they saw fresh bear prints on your road last week. Figured I'd come see if you're all right." Anna exhaled slowly, bracing herself. She'd anticipated that word might trickle out, but she'd hoped the specifics would remain vague. "I'm fine," she replied with forced nonchalance. "The bear's been around, but not causing trouble, far as I know." Bill raised an eyebrow. "That's so. The rumor mill's spitting out tall tales. Somebody insisted you fed it by hand, another said you nearly lost an arm wrestling it." He gave a dry chuckle, shaking his head at the absurdity. I'm guessing they're full of bull, but I'd like to hear from you directly. Anna colored slightly, stirring her own coffee to avoid his gaze. You know how small towns can be, she said, half laughing. The real story is simpler. The bear was in rough shape. I told the rangers. Last I heard, it wandered off. Bill studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right. I trust your judgment. You're not a fool. He sipped his coffee, lips pursed. Still, be careful. A starving bear can be the most dangerous kind. If it's truly emaciated, it might do anything to survive. He paused, his voice growing gentler. But I also know you're good-hearted, Anna. I've seen you nurse injured foxes and birds before. This is a whole nother scale, though. She offered a tight smile. I get it, Bill. I do. Honestly, if it shows up again, I'll call the rangers immediately. She hated lying about the past events, yet a small voice in her mind insisted that the danger to the bear outweighed her guilt. The conversation turned to more mundane topics, weather patterns, spring floods, the town's upcoming chili cook-off. After finishing a second cup of coffee, Bill stood with a friendly pat on her shoulder. If you ever need help, you know where to find me. He hesitated a moment, as though wanting to say more, then simply gave a curt nod and stepped outside, driving off in his battered truck. Anna watched him go, tension lingering in her chest. She appreciated his concern. He was a decent man who cared about her well-being. But the partial truths she told made her uneasy. She hoped Bill wouldn't push further or alert the rangers with unwarranted suspicions. Still, as the days passed without any sign of the bear returning, she figured the matter would slowly fade from local chatter. That was, until a sudden shift in weather triggered new complications. Near the start of April, an unseasonably warm front rolled in, melting large amounts of snow within days. Streams swelled, rushing with icy meltwater, while the ground turned muddy and slick. Roads in the lower valley became thick with slush, and the creek near Anna's property rose to an alarming level, carrying chunks of ice. In previous years, she had seen flash floods carve devastating paths across roads and farmland. This year promised to be no different. She checked her property's boundaries daily, ensuring no critical erosion threatened the foundation of her cabin or the slope behind it. Late one afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the ridges, Anna was hauling a load of scrap wood from the shed when she heard a distant roar, louder than the usual creek's flow. Her hackles raised. Setting down the wood, she moved around the cabin to see if something was amiss. Sure enough, the water in the creek had surged, coursing furiously around half-submerged boulders. Sheets of ice scraped the banks, splintering branches along the way. A sense of foreboding stirred her memories. She recalled a massive ice jam that had formed 2 winters prior, creating a sudden dam, then collapsing in a rush of water that swept through unsuspecting lowland. With haste, she packed some emergency supplies into her truck, preparing in case she needed to evacuate. She also checked her radio to see if the ranger station had put out a flood advisory. Static greeted her attempts once more, but then a brief snippet of chatter cut through. Look out for possible jam at water levels. The signal faded before she could glean specifics. Anna cursed under her breath. If the creek jammed near her place, she could be trapped or even find her cabin at risk. Darkness fell, and the creek continued its angry din. The next morning, she woke to a swirl of messages from the small battery-powered radio, the local station, broadcasting a cautionary note that certain areas near the streams were under watch for ice jams. She rummaged for her boots and jacket, deciding to see firsthand how the water was behaving downstream from her property. The road was passable enough to let her explore. She hopped in her 4x4 and drove a couple of miles along the creek, eyes peeled for white water or debris. Rounding a bend, she found a partial jam, chunks of ice wedged against a narrower pass of the creek, water backing up behind them. If it fully clogged, the water could spill over the banks, flooding adjacent land. Stopping her truck on the shoulder, Anna stepped out to inspect the area on foot. The roar of rushing water filled her ears, accompanied by the clatter of ice blocks colliding. She climbed down the snowy embankment for a closer look, boots skidding in the mud. The ice jam was formidable, creating a half-frozen wall across half the creek's width. Her heart sank. If this barrier gave way suddenly, a surge of water would blast downstream. That might threaten not only her property but also other homesteads scattered along the banks. She considered driving to the ranger station for help, but it was quite a distance, and roads remained muddy. She could also attempt a radio call from a higher vantage point. Just as she was turning to leave, a sound made her freeze, a guttural growl that cut through the roar of water. Instantly, her pulse quickened. It was the sound of a bear. Slowly, she scanned the far side of the creek, eyes straining. At first, all she discerned was a tangle of fallen branches partially submerged. Then movement caught her eye. The same patchy-furred grizzly waited in the shallows, muzzle lifted anxiously. The bear's posture was tense, as if trying to cross but thwarted by the rushing water. If it was searching for a path, the jam's turbulence was a dire obstacle. Anna's breath caught in her throat. The bear's presence so near a dangerous ice jam spelled potential disaster. If it tried to navigate the unstable chunks, it could easily be swept under or crushed. She edged closer to the bank on her side, trying to get a clearer view. The grizzly paced a few steps, placed a paw on a chunk of ice that bobbed, then recoiled. It let out a low, frustrated moan, clearly unsure how to proceed. The swirling current threatened to tear away any foothold it found. For a moment, Anna cursed her helplessness. She was on the opposite bank, separated by a torrent. Even if she wanted to help, there was no direct bridge or safe crossing. And what could she possibly do for a full-grown grizzly in a flood situation? She glanced upstream, noticing a large log jammed at an angle near the jam. If that log broke free, the entire pile of ice might shift. Swallowing hard, she realized this scenario could become catastrophic in moments. Staying calm, Anna tried to think, could she lure the bear upstream to a calmer crossing? But the river here was wide, with no easy shallows. She couldn't wade across either. She'd be risking her own life. Then an idea struck her. If she could get to the old rope bridge about a mile upstream, maybe she could make noise or wave the bear around. Although the rope bridge was mostly used by hikers in the summer, it might offer a vantage from which she could coax the bear away from the jam. It sounded far-fetched, but doing nothing meant watching the creature possibly drown if the ice jam shifted or if it foolishly tried crossing. Without wasting time, she scrambled up the embankment, jumped into her truck, and drove off, heart hammering. She knew a rough side road that paralleled the creek for about half a mile, then turned onto an even narrower track leading to a disused trailhead. The going was treacherous, potholes, muddy ruts, and partially thawed snow. More than once, the tires spun, nearly sinking. Anna coaxed the 4x4 forward, silently urging it not to fail. Each minute felt critical, her mind flashing images of the bear being swept away under grinding ice. At last, she reached a rusted gate marking the old trail. She parked haphazardly, leapt out, and grabbed her backpack, which held some rope, flares, and a whistle, common emergency items for hikes. Then she sprinted along the overgrown path, breath rasping in the cold air. The forest here was dense, branches glimmering with melting frost, the ground soggy and full of half-frozen puddles. She nearly tripped multiple times but pressed on until she heard the roar of water close by. The rope bridge lay ahead, spanning a narrower gorge where the creek funneled through towering rock walls. The structure was rickety, made of old planks and thick braided rope. A sign hammered into a post read, "Use at your own risk." Anna couldn't help a surge of nerves at the sight, but she forced it down. She stepped carefully onto the first plank, testing it. The bridge swayed ominously, but it held. Step by step, she inched toward the midpoint, each gust of wind making the ropes creak. Below, the creek thundered, swirling violently with chunks of ice and debris. Her stomach flipped, but she pressed on until she was roughly at the center, maybe 20 feet above the rushing torrent. There, she pulled a flare from her backpack. If the bear was still downstream, the sound or light might get its attention. She ignited the flare with shaking hands, sending up a brilliant red plume of smoke and sparks. Leaning against the rope, she waved it overhead and let out a sharp whistle. The echoes bounced off the canyon walls, melding with the roar of water. She wasn't certain the grizzly would see or hear, but it was better than nothing. Minutes crawled by. She alternated whistling, calling, and waving the flare. Water pelted her from below in a fine spray. Her arms ached from gripping the rope so tightly. Then, between swirling eddies of mist, she glimpsed a dark shape rounding the bend. Indeed, the bear, now upstream from where she first spotted it, possibly forced back by the jam's currents. It stood on a small rocky shelf near the water's edge, scanning the noise. With a racing heart, Anna waved vigorously, though she felt ridiculous calling out, "Over here," as if the bear understood language. The animal's ears flicked, noticing the flare's glare or hearing her calls. Yet the question remained, would it be able to climb to the bridge's side? The slopes around the gorge were steep, thick with wet brush. Still, the bear recognized something unusual, a bright pulsing light above the water, and it began picking its way along the rocks, searching for an approach. Anna's breath caught. She watched, half in terror that it might slip into the rapids. At one point, the bear lost its footing, sliding on a slick boulder, sending shards of ice tumbling. But it steadied itself, claws scraping for purchase. Slowly, the grizzly inched upward, following a narrow ledge that ascended toward the rope bridge's anchoring post. Anna prayed fervently that the ledge wouldn't crumble. She could see the animal's sides heaving with exertion, water dripping from its matted fur. At last, it crested a small bluff, only a few yards from the anchor. It stood, panting, watching Anna from across the gap. The distance between them was maybe 10 feet horizontally, but a dizzying drop of 20 feet into the gorge. Anna was so stunned by the proximity that her mind nearly blanked. She swallowed hard, lowering the spent flare. The bear gazed back, its fur patchy, ribs more visible than ever, muzzle flecked with moisture. In its eyes, however, burned a quiet determination. Anna spoke in a trembling voice, "You can't stay by the jam. Too dangerous." She motioned behind her with a jerky movement, as if beckoning the animal across the rope bridge. The idea felt insane. Could a bear cross this fragile structure? Possibly not. But maybe it could circle around to safer terrain, away from the chaotic water. For a tense moment, the two stared, the roar of water surrounding them. Then the grizzly emitted a low, rumbling moan. It stepped forward, testing the wooden beam anchoring the rope. Anna's heart lurched. If it tried to set foot on the swaying planks, the entire thing might collapse. "No, no, no," she whispered desperately. She whipped around, scanning for an alternative path the bear might take. She spotted a slope to her right, steep, but maybe workable for a sure-footed animal. She frantically pointed, though rationally she knew a wild bear wouldn't interpret her gestures like a human. Still, she tried to guide it away from the precarious plank. The grizzly sniffed the rope again, curiosity piqued, its weight shifting on the narrow ledge. Another small avalanche of gravel tumbled into the raging creek below. Anna's pulse soared. If it tries to cross here, the bridge might snap. She tried to remain calm, rummaging in her pack for another flare. Maybe a second bright light could steer it in a different direction. But just as she lit the new flare, a deep cracking noise echoed from downstream, a section of the ice jam giving way. Instantly, a surge of water burst forward, causing the creek level to spike. Ice chunks clattered like rolling boulders. The sudden flood of water hammered the gorge, sending plumes of spray into the air. The rope bridge lurched under the intensified current, and Anna clung to the ropes, gasping. On the ledge, the bear was jostled by the vibrations, nearly slipping. With a startled roar, it scrambled back from the edge. Anna heard the bridge's support beams groan. Fear seized her. She realized that if the anchor gave way, she'd be thrown into the torrent. The Grizzly reared up, possibly spooked by the noise, then dropped to all fours, backing away from the precarious vantage. Time felt suspended as Anna fought to keep her balance. The surging water below was deafening. Waves of slush and ice pounded the rock walls. The fury of it all hammered her senses, overshadowing any sense of plan. Finally, she had no choice but to retreat. She dashed across the swaying planks, each footstep a gamble. The bridge trembled, but she reached the far side, breathing raggedly. Glancing back, she saw the bear pivot away from the anchor point, moving upslope with staggering effort. For a moment, she worried it might be trapped. Then it found a break in the rocks, hauling its body upward. Relief flooded her. Scrambling onto firmer ground on her side, Anna collapsed to her knees, still clutching the flare. The roaring water drowned out all other sounds. She prayed the bear reached safety on the opposite slope. Heart hammering, she rose unsteadily, crossing the final yards to the trailhead. She glanced back, but couldn't see the Grizzly through the swirling mist and trees. At least it hadn't fallen in. Please let it find a better route around the creek, she thought. Once at her truck, she slumped into the driver's seat, tears streaming down her face from a mixture of terror and adrenaline. Her heart ached for the bear, for the precarious existence it led, always one misstep away from disaster. She was no different, forging a connection with a creature that had no place among humans. And yet she cared for it more deeply than she wanted to admit. That evening, back in her cabin, Anna built up the fire and tried to calm her frayed nerves. She replayed the day's events in her mind, the terrifying moment on the rope bridge, the surge of flooding water, the bear's struggle to climb away. There was no telling where the animal had gone or if it managed to navigate the rugged terrain. She scrawled notes in her journal. Creek jam partly broke, flooded gorge. Bear nearly tried crossing rope bridge. Madness. I have no idea if it found safety. All I can do is hope. This winter, and now this flood, keeps testing both of us. She closed the journal, shoulders trembling. Rest felt impossible. Twice that night, she went out to the porch, shining a flashlight across the yard, half expecting to see the weary Grizzly. But it never came. She stayed awake until the small hours of morning, fighting back tears of worry. Each new crisis hammered home how little control she had over nature's harshness. Over the next few days, the floodwaters gradually subsided, leaving behind reshaped banks, scattered debris, and a handful of broken ice drifts lodged among the pines. Anna ventured out carefully to assess any permanent damage. Though the jam itself had partially disintegrated, the creek still ran higher than normal. She found no fresh bear tracks near her property, which gave her a restless sense of emptiness. In the quiet nights, she often woke from dreams of the bear teetering on the edge of a roaring waterfall, or trudging alone across endless ice fields. One afternoon, Ranger Louise Henderson dropped by, checking on local homesteads after the flood. Anna gave her a calm summary of the jam's break, omitting the detail about her frantic rope bridge rescue. Louise listened intently, then brought up the matter of the Grizzly. "Any sign of that bear again?" she asked, eyes scanning Anna's face for clues. Anna shook her head, swallowing. Not in my yard. I suspect it's traveled on, hopefully found safer ground. She forced a neutral expression, burying the surge of emotion. Louise nodded. We haven't had any fresh sightings, so maybe it's moved deeper into the wilderness. Her tone carried a mixture of relief and finality. That's probably for the best. As Louise prepared to leave, Anna's chest tightened. She yearned to ask if the rangers might do more, like locate the bear with tracking or ensure it had access to food. But she knew the system seldom worked that way. Bears were wild, left to fend for themselves unless they posed a direct threat or turned up in people's garbage. She was the one who'd violated the norm, offering it shelter. The memory remained an unspoken secret. Days rolled into a week, then two, and at last the snows receded enough that the valley's earliest blossoms peeked through in meadows. Anna's trips into Silverpine grew more frequent. Every time she passed the diner or store, she half expected Bill or some other townsfolk to corner her with more rumors. But aside from occasional light chatter, folks seemed to move on. A few times she overheard them mention that starving bear, in passing, but with no new sightings, gossip lost its momentum. By mid-April, the forest brimmed with fresh scents, budding pines, damp earth, and the promise of renewal. Anna often found herself on the porch at dawn, sipping coffee while birds chirped in the branches. Sometimes she recalled how the bear had quietly laid in that very mudroom, seeking warmth, the entire scene feeling both tender and surreal. She couldn't help imagining the grizzly wandering among spring's first shoots, maybe pawing at stumps to find insects, or investigating spawning fish in the tributaries. She clung to the hope it had regained enough strength to carry on, that her impulsive kindness hadn't doomed it to rely on humans indefinitely. And so, the season of frost ended, leaving behind melted memories that hung between danger and compassion. What the coming months would bring, Anna couldn't predict. Part of her suspected she might never see that particular grizzly again. Another part, deep down, wondered if one day, perhaps next winter, she'd hear a timid scratching at her door once more. But for now, she embraced the thaw, grateful that the chapters of this harrowing winter had closed without violent tragedy. She reflected on the fleeting bond she'd shared with a frozen grizzly that had, against all odds, begged for entry into her home. The forest awakened with spring's gentle symphony, the drip of melting icicles, the rustle of small creatures emerging from burrows, the distant hammering of a woodpecker testing soft bark. Anna Caldwell, having endured the winter's ordeals, found herself steeped in gratitude each dawn, marveling at the simple relief of milder days. She busied herself repairing storm-damaged sections of her fence, tending to the garden plot where she hoped to plant vegetables once the ground thawed enough, and replenishing her woodpile, though she needed far less firewood now. Occasionally, she stepped onto the porch, gazing toward the muddy trail that led away from her cabin, half expecting a burly shape to appear among the pines. But the grizzly remained absent. Days turned into weeks. One sunny morning in early May, she decided to venture farther from home, hiking a trail that switched back up a ridge, then descended into a lush meadow overlooked by evergreen stands. The route had been inaccessible for months due to heavy snows, but with the warming weather, it seemed passable again. She packed her day pack with water, trail mix, and a basic first aid kit. Clipping a small bell to her belt, a device many hikers use to alert bears to their presence, she set off, eager to stretch her legs in terrain she hadn't visited since autumn. The initial climb was steep, the ground moist from snowmelt. Anna paced herself, leaning on a sturdy walking stick to maintain balance. She climbed under a canopy of tall firs, noticing how sunlight filtered in golden shafts, illuminating patches of moss and new sprouts. The quiet hush soothed her. Over the winter, her nerves had constantly been on edge, especially after the encounters with the stranded grizzly. Now, nature's vibrancy offered solace. She could breathe fully, letting tension melt away with each step. At the crest of the ridge, she paused to admire the panoramic view of Silverpine Valley stretching below. The creek that once raged was now flowing more gently, though still swollen with snowmelt. Across the valley, she could glimpse a patch of green farmland emerging from receding drifts. Tiny houses dotted the scene like toy blocks. She sipped water, letting the breeze cool her flushed cheeks. The day was bright, mild enough that she'd shed her heavier coat and tied it around her waist. Descending the trail, she emerged into a meadow where early wildflowers swayed, pale lavender and yellow buds, mostly, with scattered white blossoms. A few chipmunks skittered by, pausing to chatter at her intruding presence. Smiling, she moved slowly, scanning the meadow for more signs of life. This was prime bear country in warmer months, but she doubted she'd see her specific grizzly. The land was vast, and bears roamed widely. After another half-hour of leisurely hiking, she encountered a small, placid creek, less formidable than the main branch near her home. Edging down the bank, she discovered a comfortable rock to sit on, dipping her fingertips in the cold water. She pulled out some trail mix, munching while her gaze wandered the tree line. The moment felt serene, a reminder of why she chose this solitary mountain life. Yet, as so often happens, tranquility can be fragile. A sudden sharp noise broke the stillness, a distant crack echoing through the trees. Anna sat up, heart pounding. She couldn't tell if it was a gunshot, a snapped branch, or just ice breaking off a limb. Instinctively, she rose, scanning the meadow with narrowed eyes. Another crack reverberated, followed by muffled shouts. Anxiety flared. Could hunters be active here? It wasn't the typical hunting season. Or maybe loggers. But official logging in this protected area was rare. Cautious but curious, she tucked away her trail mix and followed the source of the noise, maintaining stealth. The undergrowth thickened, forcing her to skirt a cluster of alders. She advanced another 100 yards, the forest closing around her. Then she heard voices distinctly, a mix of anger and exasperation, though she couldn't make out specific words. Edging behind a large cedar, she peered into a clearing. What she saw made her breath catch. 2 men in camouflage jackets stood near a bulky shape on the ground. At first, she feared it was a wounded deer or elk. But a jolt of recognition spiked her adrenaline. The shape was a bear, sprawled in the grass. A rifle lay at one man's feet. The other man prodded the bear's flank with a boot, muttering something. Anna's heart stuttered. Was it the same grizzly? Even if not, the sight of any bear lying there with strangers hovering, rifles in hand, spelled danger. She crept closer, using the dense underbrush to conceal her approach. The men's voices drifted to her in snatches. Didn't drop right away. Damned lucky shot. Not sure if the park rangers caught wind. We gotta move fast. Anna's stomach twisted. They were poachers, it seemed, illegally hunting out of season. Her blood boiled at the thought. She fought to remain calm, scanning the scene. The bear, lying on its side, wasn't moving. A dark patch stained the fur near its shoulder. One man bent to check if it was still alive, then stepped back quickly when a feeble grunt sounded. The bear was still breathing. Anger and horror flared in Anna's chest. Poaching a grizzly was a serious crime. These men were clearly aware of that, hence their haste. She also realized that if the bear was still alive, it might be suffering immeasurably. She clenched her fists, mind racing. Should she confront them? That could be suicidal. 2 armed poachers wouldn't hesitate to threaten or harm a witness. Yet, she couldn't slink away and leave a dying bear. Indecision hammered her. She wished she had a radio or cell reception to summon law enforcement, but she was too deep in the forest. One of the men, a tall, bearded fellow, pulled out a phone, fiddling with it. No signal, he spat. We'll have to drag it out. The truck's parked about a mile off that old logging road. The other man, shorter and stocky, nodded, shifting his rifle to his other shoulder. Better finish it first. Looks like it's still breathing. He raised the rifle, aiming at the bear's head. A jolt of primal protectiveness seized Anna. Without thinking, she burst from cover, shouting, "Stop!" Her own voice shocked her, ringing out in the clearing. Both men whirled around, startled. The shorter one lowered his rifle momentarily, surprise etched on his face. Anna forced herself to stand steady, though fear roiled in her gut. "That's illegal," she said, voice trembling with fury. "Shooting a grizzly out of season. You'll face prison." The taller man sneered, glancing at his companion. "Who the hell are you?" His gaze flicked to her belt, noticing the small hiker's bell and no visible weapon, which might embolden him. Anna swallowed, aware her only weapon was the can of bear spray in her pack. She'd left her rifle at home, assuming a peaceful hike. She raised her hand slightly, as if calming a situation. "You can't kill that bear. Rangers will find out. Please, just leave it. Let me call for help." "It might still." The shorter man snarled, stepping forward. "Help. It's a worthless scrawny bear. We've been tracking it for days. Figured it's easy pickings. Must be sick or something, skulking around." He spat on the ground. "Besides, I'm not going to prison. Not for some half-dead grizzly." He lifted the rifle again, aiming at the bear's head. Anna's heart lurched. She realized she might witness a cold-blooded killing. Adrenaline surged, and before she could second-guess, she lunged to her left, grabbing a handful of gravelly dirt. She flung it toward the shorter man's face, shouting a desperate, "No." The abrupt action caused him to jerk the rifle aside, the shot firing wildly into the air with a deafening crack. Birds exploded out of the trees in alarm. Chaos erupted. The taller man cursed, reaching for his sidearm. Anna scrambled backward, fumbling for her bear spray. The shorter man wiped dirt from his eyes, livid. "You crazy," he roared, lunging toward her. She managed to unleash a burst of the pepper spray, the aerosol cloud catching him in the face. He reeled back, howling in agony, dropping the rifle. The taller man, simultaneously, aimed his handgun at her. Fear clutched Anna's throat, this could be fatal. But in that split second, the bear stirred, letting out a weak, pained growl. The taller man hesitated, glancing down. That moment's distraction gave Anna a chance to dive behind a nearby stump. She crouched, heart hammering, lungs heaving for breath. The tall man shouted curses at his partner, who was writhing, blinded by pepper spray. Anna steeled herself, adrenaline pounding in her ears. This confrontation was dangerously out of hand. Her mind raced, stay low, find cover, protect yourself. But the bear, she peered around the stump, noticing the bear feebly trying to stand, blood matting its fur. The short man stumbled, eyes streaming tears, groping for his dropped rifle. The tall man's sidearm hovered uncertainly, eyes darting between the bear, Anna, and his wounded partner. A breathless moment stretched. Then the tall man aimed at the bear, evidently deciding to finish it off before dealing with Anna. Rage and desperation ignited in her. She had to stop him. She hurled another handful of dirt and pebbles, aiming for his face. Though less accurate this time, it scattered enough debris to make him flinch, bullet whizzing into the ground mere feet from the bear. Sparks flew as the projectile struck a rock. The bear jerked, letting out a blood-curdling roar that reverberated through the clearing, a final surge of raw instinct. It scrambled upright on shaky legs, lunging toward the tall man in a flurry of claws. The man yelped, firing wildly at point-blank range. Anna's stomach plummeted. she expected the bear to collapse. Instead, it collided with him, knocking him back, his scream echoing as they toppled into a tangle of limbs. Anna grimaced, aware that a wounded bear's final thrash could be lethal. The short man, still partially blinded, groped his rifle. Anna rushed forward, her can of spray at the ready. She unleashed another burst, enveloping him in the pungent cloud, ensuring he couldn't shoot effectively. He sputtered, dropping the weapon again. Meanwhile, the bear, adrenaline-fueled, bit and swiped at the tall man, who shrieked in terror and pain. Blood flecked the grass. A wave of horror washed over Anna. She never wanted violence, but the poachers had forced a grim outcome. Finally, the tall man managed to roll aside, gasping. The bear slumped, a fresh wound in its side leaking dark blood. Clearly, one of those last shots had found its mark. It let out a ragged breath, collapsing onto the ground with a dull thud. Anna hesitated, tears burning. This was tragic. She didn't want either the bear or the men dead, yet here they were, both battered by this brutal confrontation. The short man, incapacitated by pepper spray, cried out curses, crawling on all fours. The tall man moaned, clutching a torn gash on his shoulder and possibly a broken arm. Dazed, Anna fumbled for clarity. She had to prevent further violence, tend to the wounded, and call for emergency help. Moving quickly, she kicked away the rifles, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She spotted a phone peeking from the tall man's jacket pocket. He had no signal here, but maybe if she got to a higher vantage, or used her own vantage from the ridge. The bear lay unmoving except for faint, labored panting. Heart in her throat, Anna stepped closer, ignoring the men's groans for a moment. The grizzly's eyes were half-lidded, the once pleading gaze now dulled by pain. Blood matted its thick fur, especially around the chest and flank. She sank to her knees, tears blurring her vision. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, voice trembling. She didn't know if it recognized her. She reached out a tentative hand, wanting to offer comfort. The bear's shallow exhalations formed weak puffs in the air, body trembling sporadically. She realized that with multiple gunshot wounds, the creature's chances were slim. Even a professional vet clinic might not save it. A wave of helpless fury knifed through her. Her mind flashed back to the winter nights when this very bear, half frozen, had begged entry to her mudroom. It had shown no malice then, only desperate need. Now, due to these poachers' greed or thrill-seeking, it lay mortally wounded. Catching her breath, Anna turned to the men. "Stay where you are," she warned. The short man squinted through swollen, watery eyes, cursing, but he made no move to attack. The tall man lay prone, groaning, a dark patch of blood seeping from his shoulder. They posed little threat now, though she didn't trust them. She pulled out her small portable radio from her backpack, praying it might find a signal in this semi-open clearing. Static crackled, then faintly, a ranger station channel. She pressed the transmit button, voice shaking. "Ranger station, this is Anna Caldwell. Emergency. 2 poachers, 1 severely wounded. Also a bear, critical condition. Please respond." Moments later, a crackly response, "Caldwell. We read you. Location." She reeled off her coordinates as best she could. The station operator answered, "Hang tight, we'll dispatch rangers ASAP." Relief warred with dread. Would they arrive in time to help the bear? She glanced down at the creature's labored breathing. Her chest constricted. The next half hour felt eternal. She knelt beside the bear, giving it whispered reassurances even though she doubted it could register them. Meanwhile, the men groaned, occasionally spitting curses or pleas for medical help. Anna kept them at a distance, warning that any move for the guns might provoke her to defend herself. She yearned for the rangers to appear, for an ambulance or airlift. At long last, distant engine noises approached. Soon, 2 ranger vehicles and a county sheriff's pickup found a way along a rough firebreak. The cavalry arrived in the form of Ranger Louise Henderson and 3 colleagues, plus Deputy Harris of the local sheriff's department. They spilled into the clearing, guns drawn, surveying the chaos. Anna stood, exhaustion etched on her face, explaining in trembling detail, "They shot the bear. It fought back. They're poachers." The aftermath rushed in a flurry of official procedure. The deputies took photos of the scene, seizing the poachers' rifles. One of the rangers assisted Anna away from the Grizzly site. She gave a shaky statement, describing how she stumbled upon the mid-poach and intervened. The short man cursed her pepper spray assault, but the deputy brushed him off. He had shot an endangered grizzly out of season, risking felony charges. The tall man, severely injured, was stabilized by paramedics who arrived soon after, loaded into an ambulance that bumped along the forest track. Anna hovered on the edge of the commotion, face pale and hollow-eyed, watching as they zipped the bear's remains into a tarp for transport to the ranger station. When Louise finally had a chance to speak privately, she found Anna leaning against a pine tree, eyes rimmed with sorrow. "I'm sorry, Anna," she said quietly. "You did everything you could. If not for your intervention, they might have just carted it off. At least now, they'll face charges." Anna nodded numbly, wiping her cheeks. "It was the same bear," she said, voice trembling. Louise's eyes narrowed in confusion. Anna swallowed hard, finally confessing, "The one that was half frozen on my property during winter. The one I sheltered." Her voice wavered. "I couldn't let it freeze to death back then, so I let it into my mudroom. It was desperate. I never told you the full truth because I feared you'd euthanize it or blame me for taming it." Louise's expression softened with sympathy and concern. "Anna," she sighed. "You took a huge risk. It might have caused harm, but I understand. You have a big heart. It's not your fault these men hunted it down." She laid a hand gently on Anna's shoulder. "Sometimes nature is cruel, and people can be crueler." They stood there in a moment of hushed understanding, the forest around them pregnant with sorrow. Anna inhaled the smell of pine and disturbed earth, memorizing the place where the final tragedy had unfolded. She felt a hollowness in her chest, mourning the loss of a bear that had, against all logic, entrusted its life to her in that brutal winter. And now, it ended in blood and violence under the spring sun. At last, Anna accompanied Louise back to the ranger station to finalize statements. The short man, eyes still irritated from pepper spray, glared daggers at her, while his partner was presumably en route to a hospital under guard. Paperwork was filed, arrests made, phone calls to the wildlife service. The hours blurred. By late evening, Anna emerged from the station, exhausted beyond measure. Louise offered a sympathetic nod. "We'll handle the rest. You should go home, get some rest. This has been traumatic." Anna nodded, voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she managed. Inside, she felt raw and empty, as though part of her spirit had been carved away. She drove the silent route back up the mountain, headlights cutting across the dark pines. That night, her cabin felt unbearably lonely. The mudroom where the bear once laid seemed to echo with memories. She collapsed into bed, tears finally giving way to numbness. In the following days, she settled into a subdued routine, haunted by the bear's final moments. The poachers faced charges including illegal take of a threatened species, which carried heavy fines and possible jail time. Town gossip painted Anna as a hero for confronting them. Some championed her courage in preventing further carnage. Others said she was reckless. She cared little for the talk, consumed by grief and guilt. Could she have done something differently to save the bear? The question gnawed at her, even though she knew it wasn't her fault. Support came from unexpected corners. Bill Torson visited, leaving a bouquet of wildflowers and a note reading, "My condolences. You did good." A local veterinarian dropped off a homemade casserole, offering kind words of understanding. Even Ranger Louise stopped by one afternoon with a flask of hot tea, sitting quietly on Anna's porch, sharing silent camaraderie. Eventually, a ranger lab autopsy revealed that the bear was indeed severely malnourished and carried traces of multiple old injuries, likely from an unsuccessful winter foraging. A bullet fragment from a prior wound suggested someone else might have shot it earlier in the season. All in all, it seemed the bear's life had been an unrelenting battle. Learning these details tore at Anna's heart, reinforcing that while she'd given it fleeting refuge, its fate was sealed by a broader tapestry of human cruelty and environmental hardship. Late one evening, under a sky strewn with stars, Anna found herself standing outside, gazing toward the pines. The wind carried faint whispers through the branches, as if echoing the bear's final breath. A swirl of memories, the trembling muzzle, the heat of its ragged breathing in her mudroom, the final heartbreak, enveloped her. Tears slid down her cheeks, reflecting starlight. She whispered a soft farewell, hoping somewhere the bear's spirit roamed free among endless forests, unburdened by pain. Despite her sorrow, she found a measure of closure in the understanding that she had provided it comfort in its darkest hour. Perhaps that act of compassion was not in vain, even if the ending was brutal. Life in the wild seldom afforded neat resolutions. In the weeks that followed, she planted a small sapling, a young pine, near where she'd last seen the bear alive in winter. She considered it a living memorial, a testament to empathy. Summer approached, bringing longer days, blooming wildflowers, and the hum of bees across the meadow. Anna began cultivating her vegetable garden with renewed energy, gently reminding herself that nature, for all its cruelty, also thrived on growth and second chances. She'd grown wise enough to accept that heartbreak could coexist with hope. Often, she'd glance at the mudroom door, recalling how it once sheltered a frozen grizzly who begged entry, and for a few fleeting nights, found mercy within human walls. In the weeks following the bear's death, Anna Caldwell strove to reclaim a sense of normalcy, immersing herself in the everyday tasks of mountain living, planting seeds in her garden, mending the old greenhouse windows battered by storms, and chopping leftover firewood into neat piles for the next winter. Yet no amount of routine could erase the ache embedded in her heart. She found herself pausing at odd moments, while refilling the bird feeder or tending the late spring sprouts, to recall the bear's presence in her mudroom. 1,000 little details haunted her, the soft tremor of its breath, the frozen clumps of ice dangling from its fur, the desperate whimpers that first morning. Sometimes, she would catch herself peering out the window at dusk, half expecting to glimpse the familiar silhouette leaning against her fence, begging for entry again. Word had spread through Silverpine and beyond about the confrontation with the poachers. Local news outlets had latched onto the drama: woman risks life to save wounded grizzly, poachers arrested. Journalists came knocking at Anna's door, hungry for an exclusive interview or sensational quotes. She remained guarded, refusing to spin the tragedy into entertainment. "It's not a story," she told a persistent reporter. "It's a life lost." A few articles still appeared, painting her as a courageous figure who thwarted poachers. Anna skimmed them, feeling uneasy about the hero label. She knew the truth was far more sorrowful: the bear died anyway, despite all her efforts. Amid the media flurry, the county sheriff's department and the ranger service pursued legal action against the two men, whose names were revealed as Chase Hammond, the shorter one, and Lloyd Benson, the taller. Investigations uncovered a history of prior wildlife offenses. They had been involved in other unlawful hunts, particularly targeting predators for trophies. As prosecutors gathered evidence, Anna was asked to provide a sworn statement, including her recollections of the muddy clearing where the bear was shot. She painstakingly recounted how she stumbled upon them, how they tried to finish off the wounded bear, how she intervened with pepper spray. The prosecuting attorney commended her for her courage under duress, though she admitted the entire ordeal left her emotionally scarred. Ranger Louise Henderson stayed in contact, occasionally dropping by to update Anna on the case's progress. She explained that the maximum penalty for illegally killing a threatened grizzly could be quite severe, fines up to tens of thousands of dollars and potential prison time. If the men were found guilty on multiple counts, including assault for threatening Anna, the punishment could stretch longer. Anna felt a grim satisfaction that at least some measure of justice might be served. Yet no legal sentence could bring back the creature whose trust she had briefly earned. As spring warmed the air, the once frozen land teemed with new growth. Tiny wildflowers exploded across meadows. Pine needles glistened with morning dew. Deer trotted through the valleys, their fawns wobbling on spindly legs. On a whim, Anna decided to restore her vegetable plot more ambitiously than before, planting rows of carrots, potatoes, beans, and squash. The act of nurturing new life felt therapeutic, like a silent tribute to the bear's memory. She toiled daily in the soil, turning it with a spade, mixing in compost from her winter scraps. Sometimes, she'd pause to think, this is what I can do: create, grow, protect. A stark contrast to the destructive impulses she'd witnessed in the poachers. Meanwhile, the gossip around town slowly shifted from outraged condemnation of the poachers to curiosity about Anna's well-being. Some folks approached her with kind words at the hardware store, offering small tokens, fresh eggs, homemade bread, or gentle pats on the shoulder. Others pressed with nosy questions, trying to extract dramatic details for personal excitement. Anna had little patience for that brand of prying. She'd slip away with a polite nod, seeking only the comfort of solitude. On one rainy afternoon, Bill Torson dropped by again, bringing a box of spare tools he thought Anna might need. Over cups of tea, they talked of mundane topics: how the creek levels had stabilized, how the new store manager downtown was friendlier than the last. Eventually, Bill broached the subject of the trial. "Heard the date set for mid-June," he said, gently swirling his tea. "You'll likely be called to testify, right?" Anna gave a solemn nod. "Yes, the prosecutor already informed me I'll be a key witness. I'm ready to say what I must, but I'm not looking forward to it." Bill offered a soft grunt of sympathy. "Courtrooms can be draining. But stand firm. Justice needs to see what really happened." She sighed, remembering the frantic blur of that day, bullets flying, the bear's final roar. "I just wish the bear's story didn't end that way," she murmured. "Locking those men up won't change the outcome." Bill took a moment, choosing his words. "True, it won't bring the bear back. But it might keep them from killing more bears or other animals. You did your part to save future lives." The thought provided a sliver of comfort. Anna managed a small smile. Maybe that's enough reason. Weeks spun onward. Her garden sprouted green shoots, the warming sun coaxing them skyward. Anna noticed how each seedling struggle reminded her of the grizzly's battle against the merciless winter. Life insisted on emerging even in adversity. She found solace in that parallel. Occasionally, she'd dream of the bear, sometimes happy visions where it roamed freely through lush meadows, other times nightmares about that final clearing. She'd awaken drenched in sweat, heart pounding, reaching for the lamp with trembling hands. When June arrived, the valley sparkled with early summer vibrancy. Trees donned thick canopies of leaves, birds sang at dawn in a glorious cacophony, and the once treacherous roads turned dusty with little sign of the winter's white blanket. The date of the trial crept closer, intensifying Anna's anxiety. She arranged to stay in Silver Pine for a few nights, wanting to avoid the daily mountain drive. Bill offered her a spare room, but she felt more at ease renting a small suite above the diner, somewhere neutral, where she could maintain privacy. On the first morning of the proceedings, Anna dressed in simple, neat clothes, jeans, boots, a collared shirt. She arrived at the county courthouse feeling a mix of dread and determination. The building itself was modest, a single-story structure of aged brick, a proud American flag fluttering outside. This is where truth will be told, she reminded herself. Inside, she was guided to a waiting area, wooden benches lining the corridors. She recognized a few faces, Ranger Louise in uniform, the prosecuting attorney, even some local watchers curious about a trial that carried potential headlines. The defendants, Hammond and Benson, arrived under guard, looking grim. Hammond's eyes darted briefly to Anna, brimming with resentment. Court began with opening statements. The prosecutor laid out the charges: illegal hunting of a threatened grizzly, use of firearms in a restricted area, assault with a deadly weapon, toward Anna, and more. The defense attempted to argue self-defense or confusion about boundaries. A swirl of legal jargon enveloped the small room. Anna's stomach clenched with each mention of the bear. She sat stiffly, nails biting into her palm. She felt the weight of the entire story riding on her testimony. When her name was called, she approached the witness stand, heart hammering. She swore to tell the truth. Then, in halting words, she recounted the day she found them in the clearing, how she overheard them discussing a kill, how she saw the wounded bear, how they aimed to finish it off, how she intervened with pepper spray. She omitted nothing about the final scuffle or the bullets fired. A hush fell over the courtroom, broken only by the prosecutor's gentle prodding for details. Occasionally, she glanced at the defendants. Hammond glowered, face taut with anger, while Benson stared at the floor, a sling still supporting his injured arm from the confrontation. Cross-examination by the defense proved tense. They insinuated Anna had trespassed or instigated violence by using pepper spray. She maintained composure, affirming that she acted solely to prevent an illegal act and protect herself. Ranger Louise took the stand afterward, corroborating Anna's account with physical evidence: the rifle shells found, the bullet wounds in the bear, the scuffed footprints, traces of pepper spray in the clearing. The defense's claims crumbled under the weight of forensic reports. Step by step, the prosecution built a solid case that the men knowingly targeted a vulnerable grizzly for a trophy, ignoring laws and showing reckless disregard for public safety. At midday recess, Anna stepped outside, leaning against the courthouse's brick facade, relieved to breathe fresh air. She noticed Louise approach, offering a comforting pat on her shoulder. "You did well," the ranger said quietly. Anna nodded, muscles stiff from tension. "I just want it over," she murmured. "For the bear's sake." The trial wrapped up faster than anticipated. Within 2 days, the jury found Hammond and Benson guilty on multiple felony counts. Sentencing would occur later, but the judge immediately ordered them held without bail. Some in the audience cheered softly for justice served. Yet for Anna, closure felt bittersweet. She listened numbly as the judge scheduled a sentencing date, likely months away, to finalize punishments. The gavel's echo seemed hollow, resonating with a final note of sadness rather than triumph. She left the courthouse to a smattering of camera flashes from local reporters. With a polite but weary refusal to comment, she hurried back to the diner's tiny suite, wanting nothing but solitude. That evening, as she sat on the suite's cot, an envelope was slid under her door. Curious, she picked it up. Inside lay a handwritten note: "I'm sorry for your loss. We can't bring back the bear, but we appreciate your bravery. Sincerely, the Wildlife Rehabilitation Alliance." Alongside it was a short letter explaining they were raising funds to establish a new facility near Silver Pine specifically for injured or orphaned predators. The group hoped to honor the memory of the grizzly, using Anna's story to highlight the need for a safe haven. Her throat tightened, tears threatening. The idea that the bear's ordeal might inspire better resources for future animals comforted her in a small way. She resolved to donate what she could. The next morning, she departed town early, longing to return to the solace of her cabin. The drive up the mountain was bathed in golden sunrise, the ridges alight with morning rays. She parked near her woodpile, inhaling the crisp scent of resin and damp soil. Home. Here, the painful memories and tender recollections blended into the tapestry of her daily life. She could almost sense the bear's spirit in the gentle rustle of pines, in the hush of the meadow at dusk. Summer's progression brought transformations. The meadow behind her cabin bloomed with waist-high grasses, bees buzzed in her vegetable garden, and small critters like rabbits and groundhogs scurried around. Anna would sometimes sit by the stream, allowing its steady current to soothe her mind. On one such afternoon, while perched on a rock, she found her thoughts drifting to the bear again, wondering if, in some intangible way, it roamed free in a world beyond pain. She closed her eyes, letting the gurgle of water lull her. A sense of acceptance gradually replaced her earlier anguish. She'd given the grizzly warmth when it most needed it. Despite the tragic conclusion, that act of mercy remained an unbreakable truth. By late June, rumors reached her that the newly formed Wildlife Rehabilitation Alliance had secured land near Silverpine for a small rescue center. They planned to handle orphaned or injured bears, cougars, and wolves, bridging the gap until state wildlife officials could step in. Anna felt a flutter of hope. Perhaps future creatures in dire straits wouldn't be forced to beg at human doors. She quietly pledged to volunteer if they'd have her. Then, one humid afternoon, the phone in her cabin rang, surprising her, as calls were rare. On the other end was a woman named Dr. Elaine Moss, a veterinarian championing the rehabilitation center. She invited Anna to come speak at a community fundraiser, to share her perspective on coexistence with wild animals. Anna balked, reluctant to open up those wounds in public. But Dr. Moss gently reasoned that her personal story might inspire donations, and lead to better outcomes for wildlife. After a sleepless night pondering, Anna agreed. She realized she couldn't hide forever from the bear's memory. Perhaps channeling it into a positive cause would be a tribute to the trust the creature once placed in her. So, near the end of June, she found herself standing at a makeshift podium in the backyard of a local brewery, where a crowd of about 50 people gathered under lantern-strung trees. The fundraiser had a convivial air, tables laden with potluck dishes, live folk music, and children dashing about with butterfly nets. At center stage, Dr. Moss introduced Anna as someone who's seen firsthand what happens when wildlife and humans collide, in both hopeful and tragic ways. Anxiety fluttered in Anna's stomach. But seeing the earnest faces in the audience, many wearing t-shirts with wildlife conservation slogans, gave her courage. Stepping up, she spoke haltingly at first, describing her childhood in the mountains. Then, she recounted the winter nights when a half-frozen bear arrived at her doorstep, how she let it shelter in her mudroom. The crowd listened in rapt silence. She explained how it was eventually shot by poachers, and how she'd intervened. Tears gathered in more than one listener's eyes. A hush settled, broken only by soft sniffles. Anna swallowed hard. "I'm not here to say everyone should let a grizzly into their home," she said, voice wavering. "But I'm saying there's room for compassion, and a system that ensures these animals get the help they need. If we had a rehab center or quick wildlife support, maybe that bear could have survived without putting either of us in danger." Dr. Moss nodded, stepping forward to highlight the Alliance's mission: housing short-term rescues, providing medical care, eventual release back into the wild. Applause followed, and donations poured in. By the end of the evening, they'd raised a significant sum. People approached Anna, shaking her hand, expressing admiration for her empathy. A few even confessed they'd once feared or disliked bears, but her story made them rethink. Anna offered a weary, grateful smile. This might not undo the tragedy, but it forged a path toward preventing future ones. After the event, she lingered in the brewery's twinkle-lit backyard, sipping lemonade as night cloaked the sky. She mused on the transformation, that brutal winter leading to heartbreak, culminating in a groundswell of goodwill. The ache in her heart persisted, yet she felt less alone in carrying it. Her grief had found an outlet in communal action, a shared resolve to guard the wilderness from cruelty and ignorance. In early July, an official from the state wildlife department visited her cabin to gather final data for the region's predator management plan. Anna braced for potential judgment regarding her winter actions. But the official, Mariana Solis, was surprisingly open-minded. In these remote areas, Mariana said gently, people do what they must. Letting the bear in was unconventional, but I understand your compassion. It's a reminder we need better safety nets for animals in distress. She spent hours surveying Anna's property, documenting the points where the bear lingered. Before departing, she handed Anna a small pamphlet, Guidelines for Temporary Wildlife Aid. Though it discouraged direct contact, it also detailed how to contact specialized rangers if future emergencies arose. Anna felt an odd sense of relief, as if her experience had shaped new policy dialogues. Finally, in mid-July, a letter arrived from the county courthouse announcing the sentencing of Hammond and Benson. Each received multiple years in prison, plus steep fines and a lifelong revocation of hunting licenses. Reading the details brought Anna to tears. She harbored no vindictiveness, but was relieved they couldn't harm another unsuspecting creature. She took the letter outside to her porch, where she let the golden sunlight wash over her. Justice is done, she thought, though it could never resurrect the fallen bear. As the summer deepened, wild raspberries ripened across the hills, and the local streams teemed with fish. Anna's garden flourished, bearing a bounty of lettuce, beans, and carrots. She found quiet joy in tending these living things, remembering that life's cycle didn't end with one tragedy. The seeds of compassion might grow beyond a single heartbreak. One late evening, she wandered to the creek's edge behind her cabin, lulled by the gentle burble of water. Her mind drifted to the past winter, the frigid night she first saw the bear's forlorn shape slumped by her gate. In a moment of emotional catharsis, she knelt by the water, lightly trailing her fingers in the current. I'm sorry, she whispered to the ghost of that bear, voice trembling. I hope wherever you are, you're free. She closed her eyes, letting tears fall. An owl hooted from a distant pine, as if in soft acknowledgement. Gradually, acceptance replaced guilt. She realized that grief was a measure of love, and her love for the wilderness demanded courage and humility. Perhaps that was the bear's final gift to her, an awakening to the fragile threads binding human hearts and wild spirits. Rising to her feet, she gazed at the starlit sky. Tomorrow would come with fresh tasks, a morning spent weeding the garden, an afternoon meeting with Dr. Moss to plan the rescue center's volunteer day. Life pressed forward, unrelenting yet full of promise. In the hush of that starlit moment, Anna imagined a presence beside her, the bear's essence woven into the mountain's breath, the forest's pulse. She let the wind carry her silent gratitude for the lessons learned through a bond that defied every rule. Then she turned back toward the warm glow of her cabin, determined to honor the bear's memory by nurturing all life that crossed her path, wild or otherwise. Summer glowed bright and resolute in the mountains surrounding Silverpine. Sunlight draped the meadows in gentle warmth, melting away every last vestige of winter's hold. But for Anna Caldwell, the icy memory of that desperate grizzly still echoed in her quiet moments. In this final stretch of the season, as plants thrived and wildlife roamed freely, she recognized how much the bear's story had influenced not just her life, but the community's collective conscience. Shortly after her public talk at the wildlife fundraiser, Dr. Elaine Moss invited her to join a small advisory board for the fledgling rescue center. Although Anna hesitated at first, she wasn't a biologist or a certified rehab specialist. Dr. Moss explained that her real-world experience, compassion, and practical knowledge of mountain life would be invaluable. "You know the land and the animals in a way textbooks can't teach," Moss had said with a warm smile. "We want to ensure that our rescue methods mesh with the realities of this rugged region." Thus, Anna found herself driving into town weekly, attending board meetings in a cramped office behind the local hardware store. Together with Dr. Moss, Ranger Louise Henderson, and 2 other volunteers, Greg and Irina, both wildlife enthusiasts, they brainstormed everything from enclosure designs to protocols for safely retrieving injured animals. Anna offered input on logistical concerns. What if an animal is stuck on a snowy ledge? How can we respond quickly and avoid a fiasco like what happened with the bear on my property? She'd ask, voice tinged with a mixture of resolve and lingering sorrow. Slowly, a plan took shape. They envisioned a series of low-slung structures near a large fenced enclosure, a small clinic for immediate veterinary care, a quarantine zone for newly admitted animals, and a half-acre, soft-release area where rehabilitated creatures could adjust to minimal human contact before being freed into the wild. By fall, construction might begin, funded by donations from across the state. Each brick, each timber, felt like a testament to the grizzly that once sought refuge in Anna's mudroom, a silent promise that future animals would have a safer, more appropriate place to heal. Meanwhile, Anna's day-to-day life continued under the mountain sun. She tended her flourishing garden of carrots, beans, zucchini, and potatoes. In early mornings, she would fill 2 wicker baskets with freshly harvested produce, sometimes driving them to the farmer's market in Silverpine, where neighbors marveled at her vibrant vegetables. The land, she understood, was a generous provider if treated with respect. She pictured the bear lumbering through these same woods, foraging for wild berries, had it survived. The pang of regret still lingered, but she embraced her harvests with deeper gratitude, honoring the circle of life she found herself in. Her cabin, once shadowed by winter's gloom, bustled now with open windows, letting in soft breezes and bird songs. On a few golden afternoons, she found herself smiling in the doorway of the mudroom, remembering how she'd once stacked furniture as a barricade, how the bear had lain there, half frozen, grateful for a warmth it barely understood. The space had since returned to storing coats, boots, and a few tools. But in her mind, it would forever bear the imprint of that miraculous night, an intersection of raw need and quiet mercy. Despite the peaceful lull, nature occasionally reminded her that wildness still held danger. One weekend, thunderstorms rolled in, drenching the valley with sudden downpours. The creek near Anna's property rose swiftly, though not to flood levels. She felt a twinge of panic at the memory of rushing waters that nearly swept the bear away months before. Shaking off the sensation, she secured her yard, moved anything loose indoors, and watched the storm pass. By now, she understood that such seasonal upheavals were part of a vast, unpredictable cycle. Some creatures endured, some did not, but kindness could tip the scales, at least occasionally, toward survival. As July transitioned into August, she received word that Hammond and Benson, the poachers, had officially been sentenced. Benson, the taller man, received 7 years for the illegal killing of a threatened species, along with the aggravated assault against Anna. Hammond, with a history of similar offenses, received 10. The court also levied substantial fines, ordering them to pay restitution to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Project. A sense of finality gripped Anna as she read the newspaper article detailing the verdict. She set the paper down, exhaling slowly, trying to absorb the closure. While it couldn't erase the bear's fate, at least the wheels of justice had turned decisively, dissuading others from similar crimes. That same week, she visited Bill Torson, who'd promised her some old lumber for the rescue center's early enclosure prototypes. Over coffee, Bill mentioned that a few townsfolk were still abuzz about her. "They call you the bear guardian," he said with a teasing grin. Anna snorted, half amused, half embarrassed. "I'm no guardian. "I just tried to help a dying creature," she murmured. Bill shrugged. "Sometimes that's all it takes to earn a legend in these parts. Folks need stories of bravery. Just be prepared for them to talk for a while." Anna only smiled wanly, accepting that her role in this local folklore might persist. If it inspired more empathy for wildlife, so be it. By late August, a tangible milestone arrived for the Wildlife Rehabilitation Alliance. They broke ground on a small section of land near Silverpine, a grassy knoll with scattered oaks that led into denser forest. Dr. Moss invited volunteers and donors for a modest ceremony, complete with a ribbon cutting. Anna stood among the crowd, heart swelling with cautious pride. A local band played a gentle tune while children scampered around, chasing squirrels. Moss took the microphone to speak about their shared vision. "In these mountains, nature and humans are neighbors. Our hope is that any creature in distress, be it an orphaned cub or an injured hawk, will have a chance to recover here, rather than perish at the fringes of human habitation." Applause rippled through the audience. When Moss handed the microphone to Anna, she hesitated, clearing her throat. She thought of the winter nights, the bear's pleading eyes. "We owe it to them," she began softly, "to offer a helping hand when our actions, directly or indirectly, disrupt their natural balance. Sometimes they get stuck, or starve, or freeze. My dream is that no one else has to watch a bear die on their doorstep because there was nowhere else for it to turn." A hush fell, broken by heartfelt cheers. The crowd seemed moved, and Anna felt a surge of solidarity. Here, in the sunshine, stood people determined to prevent future tragedies. It didn't erase her grief, but it granted her hope that the bear's memory would illuminate better paths for others. Throughout August, construction on the rescue center's first enclosure progressed quickly, aided by volunteer labor. Anna spent weekends hauling lumber, hammering nails, painting fences. She discovered an unexpected sense of community in these gatherings: carpenters, retirees, students, ranchers, even a few rangers, all collaborating. Break times would see them swapping stories about wildlife encounters or sharing thoughts on conservation. Strangely, the harsh experiences that had shaken Anna's world now forged a circle of camaraderie. She felt less alone, buoyed by a collective optimism. One sweltering afternoon, sweat stinging her eyes, Anna decided to take a short break from hammering. She strolled along a nearby trail, letting the forest's dappled shade cool her. There, perched on a fallen log, she found Dr. Moss, also seeking respite. The vet smiled as Anna approached. "You holding up?" Moss asked gently. "We've been pushing hard." Anna nodded, wiping her brow. "I'm all right, just reflecting on how far we've come since spring." Her gaze drifted upward, scanning the branches. A hawk circled above, screeching faintly. "It feels, I don't know, purposeful." Moss's expression softened. "You've been a key spark, Anna. Without your story, half these volunteers might not realize how close to home these issues lie." That bear, for better or worse, stirred people's hearts. Anna swallowed, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "I still wish it survived," she whispered. Moss placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We all do. But it didn't die in vain. Let's honor it with every life we save here." When September arrived, the nights began to cool again. Leaves rustled with the faint promise of autumn's arrival. Anna's garden yielded its last bounties, prompting her to can vegetables for winter storage. The rescue center's enclosure stood nearly complete, a sturdy fence arching around an acre of forested land. Plans to add a simple medical wing inside a prefabricated hut were underway. Momentum was tangible. A local philanthropic group even pledged to match donations up to a certain amount if they could complete the facility by year's end. Through all this progress, Anna wrestled with the realization that soon enough, winter would loom again, though hopefully gentler than the last. She braced herself for the possibility of encountering another desperate animal in the snow, or hearing stories from neighbors facing wildlife at their doors. But this time, she wouldn't be alone in that battle. She could call on the rescue center's volunteers, or the specially trained staff Dr. Moss was hiring. A phone tree, radio frequencies, even dedicated tranquilizers, all would stand ready. She felt a semblance of relief knowing that if some lost cub or wounded fox needed help, they'd find a place better suited than a cramped mudroom. In a reflective mood, she hiked back to that ridge where she had once spied the grizzly trudging below. Now, the valley glimmered with autumn's early gold brushstrokes, the creek shimmering with lower, calmer waters. She spotted no bears, only deer browsing in a meadow, silent and graceful. Kneeling in the tall grass, she uttered a quiet prayer of gratitude for the land's resilience and for her own. She placed a small stone at the ridge's edge, a personal token marking the place she'd watched the bear that day. We shared something profound, she thought. Even if it lasted only a season. By mid-September, the rescue center welcomed its first patient, an orphaned raccoon kit found wandering a roadside ditch. It wasn't the grand unveiling of a bear rescue, but it offered a glimpse of how the center would operate. Anna, visiting that day, helped the staff assemble a temporary enclosure within the medical hut, ensuring the young raccoon had a safe environment free from human imprint. Observing the tiny creature, wide-eyed and frightened, she recalled the bear's vulnerable eyes. She whispered encouragement, "You'll be okay here." In the background, staff arranged specialized formula, carefully minimizing direct contact to ensure the raccoon didn't lose its natural caution toward humans. Anna felt a surge of pride and relief. "We're doing it right," she thought. No more desperate last stands on front porches. Summer gave way to autumn's amber glow. The nights lengthened, a sharper chill creeping into the cabin at dusk. Anna spent more evenings indoors, organizing her winter gear and flipping through her journal entries from the previous winter. The pages recounted, in shaky script, the bear's arrival. He's half frozen, letting him in, building a barricade. She found herself crying softly, remembering how neither of them could have predicted the violent conclusion months later. But reading her own words reminded her that there had been something uniquely beautiful in that gesture of mutual trust. Perhaps the bear's spirit lingered in the hush of every snowfall, an eternal testament that compassion can transcend fear. One late afternoon, as shadows stretched long across her yard, she decided to hold a small private ceremony for the bear. She placed a handful of wildflowers she'd gathered at the memorial pine she had planted in spring, now a young sapling, its needles bright green. Beside it, she dug a small hole and buried a smooth stone on which she'd painted a simple paw print symbol. Standing there, she whispered a farewell under the darkening sky. "I hope the winter never found you wanting again, wherever you roam." Tears blurred her vision, but also a softness in her heart said, "You did what you could." With that, she stepped away, feeling a weight lift. The seasons had carried her beyond heartbreak, into a realm of healing and purpose. The final glimmers of daylight lit the valley, and she glimpsed the new rescue center's silhouette far in the distance, sprawled at the edge of Silverpine. The faint hum of cars and evening life drifted up from the town. She thought about the volunteers ready to assist the next wounded animal, the rangers better equipped for emergencies, and a community awakened to the delicate balance between humans and the wild. As dusk fully embraced the mountain, Anna walked back to her cabin. She realized that although the story of the frozen grizzly had ended in sorrow, it had also sparked a quiet revolution of empathy, herself at the forefront. The memory of those nights when the bear begged for warmth in her mudroom wouldn't vanish, but it now felt woven into a broader tapestry of hope. Each day, she would channel that memory into her work with Dr. Moss, helping shape policies, building enclosures, and guiding educational outreach. In the end, she understood that no single act of compassion guaranteed a happy ending. Sometimes, fate dealt lethal blows regardless. But every choice mattered, every seed of kindness planted could blossom into something that saved other lives down the road. And so, she would keep living in these mountains, caring for her land, her garden, her neighbors, and indeed any creature that found itself in dire straits. The next time a frantic knock came at her door, be it human or animal, she'd be ready with an open heart and a stronger safety net behind her. That night, she built a small fire in her hearth, the gentle flames casting dancing shapes on the cabin walls. Over a simple dinner of garden vegetables, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She pictured the bear, scraggly, hungry, eyes flickering with exhaustion, stepping timidly into her mudroom. She recalled the cautious barrier she erected, the nights she dozed nearby to ensure it wouldn't perish. She remembered the silent farewell each dawn as it trudged back into the cold. They'd shared a fleeting bond unburdened by words, just the raw fact of survival and mercy. And now, as the embers glowed and crickets chirped softly outside, Anna smiled with bittersweet contentment. She understood that life's tapestry was woven with both joy and tragedy, and that the best any of them could do was answer suffering with compassion, ignorance with empathy, and violence with the will to protect. The bear had taught her that. With a final sigh, she rose from her seat, doused the lamps, and climbed into bed under a cozy quilt. Outside, the wind whispered against the cabin's logs, carrying the faint aroma of pine resin and distant wildflowers. She drifted into a gentle sleep, dreaming of endless forests, swirling snowflakes, and a brown shape padding through moonlit clearings. In her dream, the bear was unhurt, majestic, and free, an echo of the connection they had once forged on the coldest nights. And in that dream, she felt no fear, only gratitude for the profound truth that, for a time, she had opened her door and her heart to a frozen grizzly who begged for life.